April 17th, 2025. Grizzly bear mauls. Three college students on hiking trip in Colorado. The morning mist clung to the peaks of Rocky Mountain National Park like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their grip on the granite faces that had stood sentinel over the Colorado wilderness for millennia. At 6:47 a.m., the first rays of sunlight pierced through the cloud cover, illuminating the Estes Park Ranger Station, where Senior Wildlife Officer Marcus Rodriguez was already 3 hours into his shift, reviewing overnight reports and preparing for what the Weather Service had predicted would be an unusually warm April day. Rodriguez, a weathered man of 43, with calloused hands and eyes that had seen too many wilderness tragedies, couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest like a stone. Spring awakening meant hungry bears emerging from winter dens, disoriented and desperate for food after months of hibernation. The unusually mild winter had disrupted normal patterns, and early reports from trail cameras suggested increased grizzly activity along popular hiking routes. 57 miles southeast, at the University of Colorado Boulder, Sarah Elizabeth Miller was stuffing the last of her camping gear into a forest green backpack that had been her faithful companion through dozens of outdoor adventures. At 20 years old, Sarah possessed the kind of infectious enthusiasm for the wilderness that made her the unofficial leader of the university's outdoor recreation club. Her auburn hair caught the morning light streaming through her dorm room window as she double-checked her gear list, a habit instilled by her father, a former Army Ranger who had taught her that preparation meant the difference between adventure and disaster. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Jacob Michael Lee, her boyfriend of 8 months and fellow outdoor enthusiast. "Ready to conquer the Rockies," the message read, followed by a series of mountain emojis that made her smile despite the early hour. Jacob, 21 and a junior studying environmental science, had been planning this trip for weeks, meticulously researching trail conditions and weather patterns with the dedication he applied to everything in his life. The third member of their party, Amanda Rose Foster, was already awake in her apartment 6 blocks away, consumed by a mixture of excitement and nervousness that had kept her tossing and turning for most of the night. At 19, Amanda was the youngest of the group and the least experienced hiker, but her determination to push beyond her comfort zone had earned her respect among her more seasoned friends. She'd grown up in suburban Denver, where her closest encounter with wildlife had been the occasional deer in her family's backyard. Amanda's parents, Dr. Robert Foster and Linda Foster, a successful orthodontist and real estate agent respectively, had expressed reservations about the trip. Their daughter's sudden interest in outdoor adventures, which had blossomed since meeting Sarah and Jacob at the beginning of the school year, worried them. They had reluctantly given their blessing after Amanda promised to stay in constant contact and follow all safety protocols. By 7:30 a.m., the three friends had rendezvoused at Jacob's apartment, their backpacks loaded with enough supplies for what they had planned as a 4-day backcountry adventure. Jacob had spent considerable time studying topographical maps of the area, selecting a route that would take them deep into the wilderness while remaining on established trails. Their destination was a remote valley known as Bear Creek Basin, accessible via the challenging but well-maintained Thunder Lake Trail. "Did everyone remember bear spray?" Sarah asked as they loaded their gear into Jacob's aging Toyota 4Runner, a reliable vehicle that had carried him on countless adventures throughout his college years. The metallic blue paint was faded, and the bumper bore stickers from national parks across the western United States, each representing a cherished memory of exploration and discovery. Amanda patted the side pocket of her pack, where the canister of bear deterrent spray rested alongside her emergency whistle and first aid kit. She had practiced deploying the spray dozens of times in her apartment, following instructions from wilderness safety videos she had watched obsessively in the weeks leading up to the trip. The weight of the canister provided a small measure of comfort, though she hoped she would never need to use it. Jacob pulled up weather reports on his phone one final time, noting the forecast called for clear skies and temperatures reaching the mid-70s by afternoon. Unusual for April in the high country, but not unprecedented. The warm weather would make for comfortable hiking conditions, though it also meant increased bear activity as the animals emerged from hibernation in search of food sources. The drive to Estes Park took just over 2 hours, winding through increasingly dramatic terrain as they left the Front Range behind and entered the foothills of the Rockies. Sarah, riding shotgun, maintained a steady stream of chatter about previous hiking experiences, her voice animated as she described a solo backpacking trip to the Wind River Range in Wyoming, where she had encountered a black bear at close range. "It was about 50 yards away when I first saw it," she recounted, her hands gesturing enthusiastically as Jacob navigated a series of switchbacks. "Just this massive black shape moving through the willows. I made noise, backed away slowly, and it completely ignored me. They're really more interested in finding food than bothering humans, as long as you don't surprise them or get between them and cubs." Amanda listened intently from the back seat, trying to absorb every detail that might prove useful if they encountered wildlife on their trip. She had read extensively about bear behavior in the weeks leading up to the adventure, but hearing first-hand accounts from someone she trusted made the information feel more real and applicable. As they approached Estes Park, the landscape transformed from rolling foothills covered in scrub oak and ponderosa pine to the dramatic vertical relief of the Front Range. Snow-capped peaks rose like ancient cathedrals against the crystalline blue sky, their faces carved by millennia of geological forces into shapes that inspired both awe and humility in those who gazed upon them. Jacob guided the forerunner through the charming tourist town of Estes Park, past shops selling outdoor gear and restaurants advertising hearty breakfasts for early-rising adventurers. Even at mid-morning, the streets bustled with activity as visitors prepared for their own forays into the wilderness that surrounded the community on all sides. The parking area for the Thunder Lake Trailhead sat at an elevation of 8,900 feet, nestled in a valley where aspen groves displayed the pale green of new spring leaves. A dozen other vehicles occupied spaces in the gravel lot, testament to the trail's popularity among serious hikers willing to tackle its challenging terrain in pursuit of spectacular alpine scenery. As they shouldered their packs and made final preparations, Sarah noticed a prominent sign posted by the National Park Service warning of recent bear activity in the area. The sign, updated just 3 days earlier, according to its date stamp, advised hikers to travel in groups, make noise while hiking, and properly store all food and scented items. A smaller addendum noted that grizzly bears had been spotted along the Thunder Lake Trail within the past week. "Grizzlies," Amanda said quietly, reading over Sarah's shoulder. "I thought grizzlies were mostly in Montana and Wyoming." "Colorado has a small population," Jacob replied, adjusting the straps on his pack. "Maybe 30 or 40 individuals in the whole state. They're expanding their range south from Yellowstone and Glacier. Seeing one would actually be pretty amazing, as long as we keep our distance." The Trailhead Register, a weathered wooden box containing a logbook for hikers to record their planned routes and expected return dates, showed that several groups had signed in within the past few days. Jacob carefully filled out their entry, noting their planned route to Bear Creek Basin and expected return date of April 21st. He included Sarah's cell phone number as an emergency contact, though he knew cell service would be non-existent once they ventured beyond the first few miles of trail. At 10:15 a.m., they officially began their hike, following a well-marked trail that immediately began climbing through a forest of Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir. The morning air carried the crisp scent of pine needles and the earthy smell of soil recently freed from winter's grip. Birdsongs echoed through the canopy as various species of warblers and thrushes went about their daily search for insects and nesting materials. Sarah set a steady pace at the front of the group, her movements efficient and rhythmic as she navigated the rocky trail that switchbacked up the mountainside. Behind her, Amanda struggled initially to find her rhythm, her breathing labored in the thin mountain air. Jacob brought up the rear, frequently pausing to point out interesting geological formations or wildlife signs to his companions. The first hour of hiking passed without incident as they gained elevation through dense forest that provided welcome shade from the increasingly warm sun. They encountered several day hikers heading back down the trail, including a couple in their 60s, who mentioned seeing fresh bear tracks in a muddy section of trail about 2 miles ahead. "Big prints," the man said, stopping to adjust his well-worn hiking boots. "Probably grizzly, based on the claw marks. Ranger at the visitor center said they've been tracking a sow with cubs in this area. You folks carrying bear spray?" Jacob patted the canister clipped to his pack's hip belt. "All 3 of us are carrying it. We'll make plenty of noise." "Good," the woman replied. "Just be extra careful if you're camping overnight." We saw some torn-up logs where it looks like she was digging for insects. Classic grizzly foraging behavior. As the couple continued down the trail, Amanda felt a fresh surge of nervousness. The abstract concept of bear encounters was becoming increasingly concrete as they ventured deeper into genuine wilderness. She checked her bear spray once again, ensuring it was easily accessible and properly oriented for quick deployment. By noon, they had covered approximately 4 miles and gained nearly 1,500 feet of elevation. The forest had begun to thin as they approached treeline, offering glimpses of the dramatic peaks that surrounded them on all sides. They stopped for lunch at a scenic overlook where a small creek cascaded down granite slabs, worn smooth by countless years of flowing water. Sarah spread their topographical map on a flat boulder, tracing their route with her finger as they shared energy bars and trail mix. "We're making good time," she observed. "If we maintain this pace, we should reach Bear Creek Basin by mid-afternoon. That'll give us plenty of time to set up camp and explore a bit before dark." Jacob studied the contour lines on the map, noting the increasing steepness of the terrain ahead. The trail would climb another 800 feet over the next 2 miles before descending into the basin they had chosen as their first night's campsite. Weather conditions remained perfect, with temperatures in the comfortable 70s and not a cloud in the brilliant blue sky. Amanda had begun to feel more confident as the morning progressed. Her initial nervousness had given way to excitement as she realized she was hiking deeper into wilderness than she had ever ventured before. The absence of any human development, the purity of the air, and the overwhelming scale of the landscape filled her with a sense of wonder that made the physical discomfort of the challenging hike seem insignificant. As they resumed hiking after lunch, the trail became increasingly rocky and exposed. They were now well above treeline, traversing terrain where only the hardiest alpine plants could survive the harsh conditions of winter. Picas, small rabbit-like creatures perfectly adapted to life among the rocks, chattered warnings to each other as the hikers passed through their territory. The bear tracks the elderly couple had mentioned became visible in a muddy section of trail at approximately the 4.5-mile mark. The prints were indeed impressive, measuring nearly 6 inches across with prominent claw marks extending well beyond the toe pads. Sarah knelt to examine them more closely, noting their freshness and the depth of the impression in the soft earth. "Definitely grizzly," she confirmed, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and respect. "Look at the spacing between the front and back paws. This is a big bear, probably an adult female based on the size." Jacob photographed the tracks with his phone, though he knew the images would remain stored in the device until they returned to civilization and regained cell service. The presence of fresh sign added an element of excitement to their adventure, proof that they were truly in wild country where humans were visitors rather than permanent residents. They continued climbing, following the tracks for nearly half a mile before the trail surface became too rocky to reveal clear prints. The bear had been heading in the same direction they were traveling, toward the high country where early spring vegetation would be emerging from the winter snow. At 2:30 p.m., after nearly 4.5 hours of steady hiking, they crested a ridge and gazed down into Bear Creek Basin, their destination for the night. The valley stretched before them like a pristine amphitheater, its floor covered in meadows that would soon burst with wildflowers as the brief alpine summer progressed. A crystalline stream meandered through the center of the basin, fed by snowmelt from the surrounding peaks. The descent into the basin took another 45 minutes as they carefully picked their way down a steep and rocky trail that required constant attention to foot placement. Amanda found this section particularly challenging, her legs trembling from fatigue as she struggled to maintain balance on the loose rock surface. They established their campsite in a grove of ancient white-bark pines near the stream, following leave-no-trace principles by selecting a spot that had obviously been used by previous visitors. Jacob and Sarah worked efficiently to set up their two-person tent, while Amanda assembled her smaller solo shelter, a lightweight model she had purchased specifically for this trip. The process of making camp was meditative and satisfying after hours of physical exertion. They arranged their sleeping bags and personal gear inside their respective tents, then established a cooking area downwind and at least 50 yards from their sleeping area, as recommended for bear country camping. As evening approached, they prepared a simple but hearty dinner, using a lightweight backpacking stove and dehydrated meals that required only the addition of boiling water. The food, while not gourmet by any standards, tasted incredible after a day of hard physical work in the mountain air. Sarah had assumed responsibility for food storage, carefully placing all scented items, including toiletries, trash, and cooking gear, into bear-proof containers that would spend the night suspended from a cable system they rigged between two trees. The process was time-consuming and required considerable effort, but all three understood the critical importance of keeping attractants away from their sleeping area. As darkness settled over the basin, they sat around their small camp stove, sharing stories and watching the first stars appear in the crystalline mountain air. The temperature had dropped considerably with the setting sun, and they bundled into warm layers as the alpine chill penetrated their clothing. "Listen to that silence," Amanda whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle murmur of the nearby creek. The absence of human-generated sound was profound and slightly unnerving for someone accustomed to the constant background noise of urban life. Jacob checked his GPS device one final time before the unit's battery died, confirming their position at approximately 10,200 feet elevation in the heart of designated wilderness. They were now more than 6 miles from the nearest road and at least 12 hours of hiking from cell phone coverage or any form of outside communication. By 9 p.m., exhaustion from the day's exertion had begun to overtake their desire to stay awake and enjoy the spectacular night sky. They performed final checks of their food storage system and tent guidelines before retreating to their respective shelters for the night. Sarah reminded everyone to keep their bear spray and headlamps within easy reach inside their tents. Amanda lay in her sleeping bag, listening to the night sounds of the wilderness, identifying the calls of owls and the distant howl of coyotes echoing off the surrounding peaks. Every rustle in the nearby vegetation caused her pulse to quicken, but she gradually relaxed as she realized most of the sounds were caused by small nocturnal creatures going about their nightly activities. Sleep came eventually, though it was punctuated by periods of wakefulness as her urban-adapted nervous system struggled to adjust to the profound darkness and unfamiliar sounds of the alpine environment. Each time she awakened, She could hear the steady breathing of her companions in the nearby tent, finding comfort in their presence. The first hint of dawn arrived at 5:43 a.m. as the eastern peaks began to glow with alpenglow, that magical phenomenon where snow-covered summits catch and reflect the first light of the rising sun. Sarah was the first to emerge from her tent, drawn by the spectacular display of colors painting the surrounding mountains in shades of rose and gold. She quietly fired up the camp stove to begin heating water for coffee and hot breakfast, moving carefully to avoid disturbing her sleeping companions. The morning air was crisp and still, with temperatures well below freezing despite the warm afternoons they had been experiencing. Jacob emerged shortly after, attracted by the smell of brewing coffee and the warm glow of the small stove flame. He stretched his stiff muscles and looked around the basin with appreciation, noting how different the landscape appeared in the soft light of early morning. "Sleep well?" Sarah asked quietly, handing him a steaming mug of coffee that he accepted with grateful hands. "Better than I expected," he replied, "though I kept dreaming about bears. Probably because of those tracks we saw yesterday." Amanda joined them 15 minutes later, her hair tousled from sleep and her movements stiff from spending the night on the hard ground. She had slept poorly, awakened repeatedly by sounds that her imagination had transformed into approaching wildlife. Their second day began with a hearty breakfast of oatmeal, fortified with dried fruit and nuts, washed down with multiple cups of coffee that helped warm their bodies and prepare them for another day of exploration. They had planned to spend the day hiking to a series of alpine lakes higher in the basin, a round trip of approximately 8 miles over challenging terrain. After breaking camp and securing their base camp setup, they departed at 8:30 a.m. with day packs containing water, lunch, extra layers, and emergency equipment. The morning air remained cold, their breath visible in small puffs as they began climbing toward the head of the valley. The trail became increasingly faint as they gained elevation, eventually disappearing entirely as they entered true wilderness, where navigation required map and compass skills rather than dependence on maintained pathways. Jacob took the lead, using his GPS device and topographical map to guide them toward their destination. They had been hiking for approximately 2 hours when Sarah noticed the ravens. A pair of large black birds circled overhead, their raucous calls echoing off the surrounding granite walls. Ravens were often indicators of carrion, and their presence in this remote location suggested something had died recently in the vicinity. "Could be a winter kill," Jacob observed, following Sarah's gaze toward the circling birds. "Elk or deer that didn't make it through the winter. The snow probably just melted enough to expose it." They continued climbing, but the ravens' behavior became increasingly agitated as they approached the head of the valley. The birds dove and circled with obvious excitement, their calls growing louder and more persistent. Amanda found their behavior unnerving, though she couldn't articulate exactly why. The sight of the birds filled her with growing unease. At 11:15 a.m., they reached the first of the alpine lakes they had come to visit, a pristine body of water still partially covered with ice from the long winter. The lake sat in a cirque carved by glacial action thousands of years ago, surrounded by near-vertical granite walls that rose more than 1,000 feet from the water's edge. The ravens had disappeared, their attention apparently drawn elsewhere, and the 3 friends spent time exploring the shoreline and marveling at the untouched beauty of their surroundings. They ate lunch on a sun-warmed granite slab that provided welcome relief from the cold morning air. "This is why we do this," Sarah said, gesturing toward the spectacular panorama that surrounded them. "You can't get this experience any other way. No photograph or description can capture what it feels like to stand in a place like this." Amanda nodded in agreement, though part of her consciousness remained alert to their surroundings in a way that prevented complete relaxation. The vastness and isolation of their environment, while beautiful, also emphasized their vulnerability should anything go wrong. They spent 2 hours at the lake before beginning their descent back toward base camp. The afternoon sun had warmed the air considerably, and they stripped off the heavy layers they had needed during the cold morning hours. The snow that had covered much of the high country during their early morning ascent was beginning to melt, creating numerous small streams that crossed their path. The return hike proved more challenging than expected, as the warming temperatures had made the terrain increasingly treacherous. Rocks that had been frozen solid in the morning were now loose and unstable, requiring careful attention to every step. Amanda struggled with the conditions, her confidence from the previous day beginning to erode as fatigue and the technical difficulty of the terrain tested her limits. At approximately 2:45 p.m., as they descended through a section of large boulders and stunted vegetation, Jacob stopped abruptly and raised his hand to signal the others to halt. His body language communicated immediate alarm, though he made no sound as he slowly reached for the bear spray on his hip belt. Sarah and Amanda froze in place, their eyes following Jacob's gaze toward a cluster of boulders approximately 30 yards ahead. Initially, they saw nothing unusual, just the typical jumble of granite blocks and alpine vegetation. Then, as their eyes adjusted and began to distinguish shapes and patterns, they saw what had captured Jacob's attention. A massive grizzly bear stood partially concealed behind one of the larger boulders, its distinctive humped shoulders and dished face clearly visible in profile. The animal appeared to be feeding on something hidden from their view, its powerful claws tearing at what looked like a carcass of some sort. The bear was enormous, easily twice the size of the black bears that occasionally wandered into Colorado from neighboring states. Its coat was a rich brown color with silver-tipped guard hairs that caught the afternoon sunlight. Most alarming was its proximity to their intended path, which would have brought them within 20 feet of the feeding animal. Sarah slowly reached for her own bear spray while trying to assess their options. The terrain offered limited alternatives for retreat, as steep slopes rose on both sides of the narrow valley they were traversing. Moving backward would require navigating the same treacherous rock field they had just descended, a process that would take considerable time and involve significant noise. The bear had not yet noticed their presence, absorbed as it was in feeding on whatever carcass it had claimed. This provided them with a crucial advantage, as surprising a feeding grizzly represented one of the most dangerous scenarios possible in bear country. Amanda stood frozen with terror, her mind struggling to process the reality of their situation. The bear was far larger and more intimidating than anything she had imagined during her preparation for the trip. Its massive head and powerful build spoke of an animal perfectly evolved for survival in this harsh mountain environment. Jacob motioned for them to begin backing away slowly, following the protocol they had discussed but hoping never to implement. Every movement had to be deliberate and controlled, as sudden motion or noise could trigger a defensive response from the bear. They had retreated perhaps 10 feet when disaster struck in the form of loose rock under Amanda's foot. A chunk of granite the size of a bowling ball shifted under her weight, dislodging several smaller stones that clattered down the slope with sounds that rang like gunshots in the thin mountain air. The grizzly's head snapped up immediately, its small dark eyes scanning for the source of the disturbance. When its gaze locked onto the three humans, the bear's entire demeanor changed in an instant. Its ears flattened against its skull, its lips pulled back to reveal massive canine teeth, and a deep growl emanated from its throat. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, both predator and prey remained motionless, sizing each other up across 30 yards of rocky terrain. The bear's intelligence was clearly evident as it evaluated the threat posed by the humans while simultaneously protecting its food source. Sarah spoke in a low, calm voice, following the protocols she had learned through years of wilderness experience. "Easy, bear. We're backing away. We don't want your food." Her words were intended to communicate non-aggressive intent while establishing their human identity, as bears sometimes responded better to human voices than to silent retreat. The grizzly stood on its hind legs, rising to a height of nearly 8 feet as it tested the air with its sensitive nose and tried to better assess the situation. Standing upright was not necessarily aggressive behavior, but rather the bear's way of gathering more information about these intruders in its domain. Jacob had his bear spray ready but hadn't deployed it, knowing that the 30-yard distance was at the extreme range of effectiveness for the deterrent. Wind conditions were relatively calm, which would help accuracy if he needed to use the spray, but he hoped their slow retreat would convince the bear to return to its meal. The standoff continued for nearly 2 minutes, with the bear alternately standing and dropping to all fours while the humans maintained their controlled retreat. Amanda fought to control her breathing, knowing that hyperventilation could lead to loss of consciousness at the worst possible moment. Then, without warning, the bear's demeanor shifted from wary assessment to obvious aggression. Its ears flattened completely, its head lowered, and it began to move toward them with the distinctive side-to-side gait that preceded a charge. "Bear spray!" Sarah shouted, abandoning the quiet tones she had been using to communicate with the animal. All 3 humans fumbled for their deterrent canisters as the grizzly closed the distance between them with terrifying speed. Jacob was the first to deploy his spray, triggering an orange cloud of capsaicin that drifted toward the approaching bear. The wind conditions, which had seemed favorable moments earlier, shifted slightly, causing some of the spray to blow back toward the humans and reducing its effectiveness against their target. The bear hit the outer edge of the spray cloud and momentarily hesitated, shaking its head and snorting as the irritating chemicals affected its sensitive nose and eyes. For a brief moment, it appeared the deterrent might be successful in stopping the charge. But the bear's momentum and aggressive state overcame the temporary discomfort of the pepper spray. It emerged from the cloud with renewed determination, its small eyes locked on Jacob as the closest and most threatening of the 3 humans. The final 20 yards disappeared in seconds as the grizzly covered ground with bounds that demonstrated the incredible athleticism of an animal that could outrun a horse over short distances. Jacob had time for one more burst of bear spray before the 400-pound predator crashed into him with the force of a freight train. The impact drove Jacob backward against a granite boulder with a sickening sound that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The bear's massive jaws clamped down on Jacob's torso, its teeth puncturing his ribcage as easily as needles piercing fabric. His screams echoed off the surrounding peaks, a sound of primal terror and agony that seemed to belong to some prehistoric nightmare. Sarah and Amanda stood frozen in absolute horror as their friend disappeared beneath the writhing mass of brown fur and claws. The bear shook Jacob like a rag doll, its powerful neck muscles tossing his body from side to side with effortless violence. Blood began to stain the granite and sparse vegetation surrounding the attack site. "Jacob!" Sarah screamed, her voice breaking as she watched the animal that had been her boyfriend just moments earlier being torn apart by 400 pounds of evolved killing machine. Her mind struggled to process the transition from peaceful wilderness experience to life or death emergency in the span of seconds. Amanda triggered her own bear spray, though the bear was now too close to her friends for the deterrent to be effective without also affecting Jacob. The orange mist drifted uselessly in the afternoon breeze as the attack continued with methodical brutality. The grizzly had Jacob pinned against the boulder, its claws raking across his chest and arms as its jaws maintained their grip on his torso. Jacob's struggles were growing weaker, his body going into shock from massive blood loss and traumatic injuries. His eyes, when they were visible between the bear's attacks, showed a glazed quality that suggested he was already slipping away from consciousness. Sarah grabbed a rock the size of a softball and hurled it at the bear with all her strength, striking the animal in the shoulder. The impact had no visible effect on the grizzly, which was completely focused on its attack and showed no signs of releasing its grip on Jacob's mangled body. "Get away from him!" Amanda screamed, her voice high-pitched with terror and adrenaline. She threw her own rock, a smaller stone that bounced harmlessly off the bear's thick hide. The animal's concentration on Jacob was complete, as if the other humans had ceased to exist. The attack continued for what felt like hours, but was actually less than 2 minutes. Jacob's movements gradually ceased, as shock and blood loss took their inevitable toll. His body went limp in the bear's grip, though the animal continued to maul him with mechanical persistence. Finally, the grizzly seemed to recognize that its victim was no longer fighting back. It released its grip on Jacob's torso and stepped back, breathing heavily from its exertion. Blood covered its muzzle and front paws, and its small eyes showed the kind of focused aggression that indicated it was still prepared to defend itself against additional threats. Jacob lay motionless against the boulder, his body positioned at unnatural angles that suggested massive internal injuries. His chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular breaths that were barely visible from where Sarah and Amanda stood. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the rocky soil and sparse alpine vegetation. The bear looked directly at the two surviving humans, its gaze calculating and predatory. For a terrifying moment, it appeared ready to launch another attack, this time targeting one of them. Sarah grabbed Amanda's arm, preparing to run, despite knowing they could never outpace a grizzly over the rocky terrain. But something in the bear's demeanor shifted. Its ears came forward slightly, and it took several steps away from Jacob's body. The animal's aggressive posture relaxed marginally, though it continued to watch the humans with obvious wariness. "Don't move," Sarah whispered to Amanda, her voice barely audible. "Let it decide we're not a threat." They remained motionless for several minutes as the bear continued its assessment. The animal occasionally looked back toward its original feeding site, suggesting it was torn between protecting its carcass and dealing with the human intruders. Eventually, the grizzly made its decision. It moved away from Jacob's body with deliberate steps, returning to the cluster of boulders where it had been feeding when they first encountered it. The bear disappeared behind the rocks, though they could hear occasional sounds that suggested it had resumed its meal. Sarah waited another 5 minutes before approaching Jacob, her movements slow and deliberate to avoid triggering another attack. Amanda followed at a distance, her face pale with shock and her hands trembling uncontrollably. Jacob was still breathing when Sarah reached him, though his condition was obviously critical. His chest had been crushed by the bear's jaws, and deep claw marks across his torso had opened major blood vessels. His face was grey with blood loss, and his breathing was shallow and irregular. "Jacob, can you hear me?" Sarah whispered, kneeling beside his broken body while keeping one eye on the location where the bear had disappeared. There was no response from Jacob, whose consciousness had fled to some deeper place where pain couldn't follow. Amanda knelt on Jacob's other side, her hands hovering over his injuries without knowing how to help. The extent of the damage was overwhelming, far beyond anything their wilderness first aid training had prepared them to handle. It was clear that Jacob needed immediate medical attention that was hours away from their current location. "We have to get help," Amanda said, her voice thick with tears. "We have to get him to a hospital." Sarah looked around their surroundings, assessing their options with the part of her mind that was still capable of rational thought. They were more than 6 miles from the trailhead, over difficult terrain that would be challenging for experienced hikers under normal conditions. Carrying Jacob in his current condition would be impossible for just the two of them. "One of us has to go for help," Sarah said quietly. "The other needs to stay with Jacob." The decision was agonizing, as neither option offered much hope. Leaving Jacob alone with his injuries in bear country was effectively a death sentence, but attempting to move him would likely kill him as well. Their only real chance was to get professional rescue personnel to their location as quickly as possible. "I'll go," Amanda said immediately. "You know wilderness medicine better than I do. You should stay with him." Sarah nodded, though she felt utterly helpless as she looked at Jacob's failing body. Her wilderness first aid training covered treating shock, controlling bleeding, and stabilizing fractures, but Jacob's injuries were beyond anything she could meaningfully address with the supplies in their daypacks. Amanda gathered her bear spray and emergency supplies, along with Jacob's GPS device that still held their exact coordinates. The unit's battery was nearly dead, but it contained enough charge to provide critical location information to rescue personnel. "Make as much noise as possible when you hike out," Sarah instructed. "Talk, sing, bang rocks together. We don't know where that bear is, and you don't want to surprise it." Amanda nodded, though her face showed the terror she felt at the prospect of hiking alone through bear country while in a state of emotional shock. Every shadow and rock formation would seem to hide a predator, and every sound would trigger fight-or-flight responses that would make rational decision-making nearly impossible. "Tell them we need helicopter evacuation," Sarah added. "Ground-based rescue won't be fast enough." Amanda began her desperate race against time at 3:47 p.m. according to Sarah's watch. She moved as quickly as safety would allow over the treacherous terrain, fighting the urge to run that would inevitably lead to a fall and potential injury that would doom all three of them. Sarah turned her attention to Jacob, doing what she could to make him more comfortable while monitoring his vital signs. His pulse was weak and rapid, his breathing shallow and increasingly irregular. She covered him with her spare jacket to combat shock, though she knew his internal injuries were beyond anything first aid could address. The afternoon stretched into evening as Sarah maintained her vigil beside Jacob's broken body. The bear occasionally made sounds from its feeding site, reminding her of the continued danger they faced. As darkness approached, she began to worry about hypothermia adding to Jacob's life-threatening injuries. Amanda's progress down the mountain was slowed by exhaustion, emotional shock, and the technical difficulty of navigating alone over terrain that had been challenging even with 3 people. She fell twice, suffering scrapes and bruises that seemed insignificant compared to Jacob's condition, but that further slowed her desperate race for help. By the time Amanda reached the trailhead at 8:23 p.m., more than 4.5 hours after beginning her emergency descent, she was stumbling from exhaustion and dehydration. The parking area was empty except for Jacob's Forerunner, a stark reminder of how isolated they had been during the attack. Amanda's cell phone showed no signal even at the trailhead, forcing her to drive nearly 10 miles before finding coverage. Her first call was to 911, though her emotional state made it difficult for the dispatcher to understand the nature and location of the emergency. "There's been a bear attack," she managed to say through her tears and hyperventilation. "My friend is dying. We need helicopter rescue immediately." The dispatcher, trained to handle emergency calls with calm professionalism, began gathering crucial information about the location, nature of injuries, and current status of the victim. Amanda provided GPS coordinates from Jacob's device and described the access route as best she could remember. "Is the victim conscious?" the dispatcher asked. "He was unconscious when I left," Amanda replied. "He lost so much blood. The bear crushed his chest. I don't know if he's still alive." Emergency response protocols went into immediate effect as the dispatcher contacted Rocky Mountain National Park Rangers, Emergency Medical Services, and Flight for Life helicopter services. Senior Ranger Marcus Rodriguez, who had been monitoring radio traffic from his office, immediately recognized the gravity of the situation and began coordinating rescue operations. The remote location and approaching darkness complicated rescue planning significantly. Helicopter operations in mountainous terrain were dangerous under the best conditions, and night flying added exponentially to the risks faced by flight crews and medical personnel. "We need to get a team on the ground tonight," Rodriguez told his assembled staff. "Even if we can't evacuate until first light, someone needs to reach that victim and provide medical support." A ground-based rescue team consisting of 4 experienced wilderness emergency medical technicians began preparing for immediate deployment. They would hike through the night using headlamps and night vision equipment, carrying medical supplies and communication gear that would allow them to stabilize Jacob and prepare for helicopter evacuation at first light. Meanwhile, Sarah continued her lonely vigil beside Jacob as darkness settled over the Alpine basin. She had managed to start a small fire using emergency matches and dry tinder, providing both warmth and a signal that might help guide rescuers to their location. Jacob's breathing had become increasingly labored, and she feared he wouldn't survive until help arrived. The bear had remained in the vicinity, occasionally making sounds that suggested it was still feeding on whatever carcass had attracted it to the area initially. Sarah fought to stay awake and alert, knowing that falling asleep could prove fatal if the animal decided to investigate their camp. At 11:47 p.m., more than 8 hours after the attack, Sarah heard voices calling from somewhere down the valley. The rescue team had made remarkable time over the challenging terrain, driven by the knowledge that every minute counted in a medical emergency of this magnitude. "Up here!" Sarah called back, her voice hoarse from hours of stress and dehydration. "We're up here!" 4 headlamp beams appeared in the darkness, bobbing and weaving as the rescue team navigated the final approach to their location. The lead rescuer, a paramedic named Jennifer Walsh with 15 years of wilderness emergency medicine experience, immediately began assessing Jacob's condition while her team established a perimeter around the casualty site. "How long has he been unconscious?" Walsh asked Sarah as she checked Jacob's vital signs. "Since right after the attack," Sarah replied. "About 8 hours ago. He was breathing better earlier, but it's gotten worse in the last couple hours." Walsh's examination revealed the extent of Jacob's injuries, confirming her worst fears about his chances for survival. Multiple rib fractures had punctured both lungs, causing them to collapse partially. Massive blood loss from claw wounds across his torso had sent him into profound shock. Most critically, the bear's bite appeared to have damaged major blood vessels in his chest cavity. "We need helicopter evacuation at first light," Walsh radioed to the incident command post that had been established at the trailhead. "Patient has penetrating chest trauma with bilateral pneumothorax, massive blood loss, and altered mental status. Current vitals show BP 60/40, pulse 140 and thready. Respiration shallow and irregular at 28 per minute." The medical team worked through the night to stabilize Jacob using intravenous fluids, oxygen, and medications to support his failing cardiovascular system. Sarah provided crucial information about the timeline of events and Jacob's condition during the hours she had been alone with him. Dawn came at 6:12 a.m. on April 18th, revealing a scene that would remain etched in the memories of everyone present. Jacob lay surrounded by medical equipment and blood-stained bandages, his face grey with shock and his breathing supported by a battery-powered ventilator. The rescue team had transformed the remote Alpine setting into an improvised intensive care unit. The Flight for Life helicopter appeared at 6:47 a.m., its distinctive red and white colors bright against the morning sky. Pilot Captain Mike Stevens and flight paramedic Lisa Rodriguez had launched from Denver despite marginal weather conditions, knowing that ground-based evacuation over 6 miles of difficult terrain would take far too long for a patient in Jacob's condition. Landing in the confined space of the Alpine Basin required exceptional skill and precision, as the helicopter's rotor wash created whirlwinds of dust and debris that reduced visibility to near zero. Stevens managed to settle the aircraft on a relatively flat area, approximately 50 yards from the casualty site. The evacuation itself took 23 minutes as the medical team carefully moved Jacob from the improvised treatment area to the helicopter's patient compartment. Every movement had to be coordinated and controlled to avoid worsening his internal injuries or dislodging the medical devices keeping him alive. Sarah was allowed to accompany Jacob in the helicopter, strapping into a small seat where she could hold his hand during the flight to Denver Health Medical Center. Amanda followed in a park service vehicle, her own emotional state requiring monitoring by rescue personnel who were concerned about delayed shock and potential psychological trauma. The helicopter flight took 38 minutes, racing against time as Jacob's vital signs continued to deteriorate despite aggressive medical intervention. Flight paramedic Rodriguez worked constantly during the flight, adjusting medications and monitoring the life support equipment that was the only thing standing between Jacob and death. ETA 2 minutes, Stevens called over the aircraft's intercom as the Denver skyline appeared on the horizon. I've got trauma team standing by at the helipad. The landing at Denver Health Medical Center was followed by a carefully choreographed transfer to the hospital's trauma bay, where a team of emergency physicians and trauma surgeons had been preparing for Jacob's arrival since receiving word of the helicopter's departure from the mountains. Dr. Michael Chang, the attending trauma surgeon, took one look at Jacob's condition and immediately ordered him to the operating room. The young man's injuries were among the most severe Chang had seen in 20 years of trauma surgery, and his chances for survival were minimal, even with immediate surgical intervention. "Type and cross for 20 units of blood," Chang ordered as his team prepared Jacob for emergency surgery. "Get me 2 large-bore IVs and call for more help. This is going to take everything we have." Sarah found herself in a hospital waiting room, still wearing hiking clothes stained with Jacob's blood and her own tears. The sterile environment and fluorescent lighting seemed surreal after spending nearly 20 hours in the wilderness, dealing with life and death in its most raw form. Amanda arrived at the hospital 90 minutes later, accompanied by a victim services coordinator who had been assigned to help the survivors navigate the complex aftermath of their traumatic experience. Both young women were examined by medical staff and treated for dehydration, exhaustion, and the early stages of psychological shock. The first surgery lasted 7 hours, as Dr. Chang and his team worked to repair the massive internal damage caused by the bear's attack. Jacob had lost nearly 60% of his blood volume, requiring massive transfusions to maintain circulation to his vital organs. Multiple rib fractures had punctured both lungs, necessitating surgical repair and insertion of chest tubes to re-expand the collapsed lung tissue. Most critically, the bear's bite had severed major blood vessels in Jacob's chest, causing internal bleeding that had continued for hours before rescue personnel reached him. Chang managed to locate and repair the damaged vessels, though the prolonged blood loss had caused significant damage to Jacob's brain, heart, and kidneys. "He's alive, but his condition is extremely critical," Chang told Sarah and Amanda after emerging from the operating room. "The next 24 hours will tell us whether he can survive these injuries. Even if he does survive, there may be permanent damage from the blood loss and shock." Jacob was transferred to the surgical intensive care unit, where he remained on life support, surrounded by monitors and machines that tracked every aspect of his body's struggle for survival. Sarah and Amanda were allowed brief visits, though Jacob remained unconscious and showed no response to their presence. News of the bear attack spread quickly through social media and local news outlets, as dramatic wilderness emergencies always captured public attention. Reporters gathered outside the hospital seeking interviews with the survivors, while wildlife officials began investigating the circumstances that had led to the attack. Colorado Parks and wildlife biologist Dr. Sarah Tomlin arrived at the hospital on the evening of April 18th to interview Sarah and Amanda about their encounter. Tomlin, who had spent 15 years studying bear behavior and managing human-wildlife conflicts, needed detailed information about the circumstances of the attack to determine what response was appropriate. "Can you walk me through exactly what happened?" Tomlin asked, her digital recorder capturing every detail of the survivor's account. "I need to understand the bear's behavior and what might have triggered the attack." Sarah recounted the events leading up to the encounter, describing the fresh tracks they had observed, the presence of ravens suggesting a carcass in the area, and the bear's initial behavior when they first spotted it. Amanda added details about the sounds that had alerted the bear to their presence and the sequence of events that had led to the charge. "The bear was definitely feeding on something when we first saw it," Sarah explained. "It seemed more focused on protecting its food than on us, at least initially. But when Amanda accidentally dislodged those rocks, everything changed." Tomlin took careful notes about the bear's physical description, its behavior before and during the attack, and the location where the encounter had occurred. This information would be crucial in determining whether the bear posed a continuing threat to other wilderness users. "Based on what you've told me, this sounds like a defensive attack by a bear protecting a food source," Tomlin concluded. "That's actually somewhat encouraging from a management standpoint, as it suggests the bear wasn't actively hunting humans. However, the fact that the bear had made physical contact with humans and caused life-threatening injuries meant that wildlife officials would need to locate and remove the animal from the wilderness area. A bear that had attacked humans, regardless of the circumstances, could not be allowed to remain where it might encounter other hikers. A team of wildlife officers and tracking specialists was assembled to return to Bear Creek Basin and attempt to locate the grizzly. The team included expert marksmen equipped with high-powered rifles, as capturing a large grizzly alive in remote wilderness was extremely dangerous and often impossible. The search team reached the attack site on the morning of April 19th, finding evidence of the encounter scattered across the rocky terrain. Bloodstains marked the location where Jacob had been mauled, while tracks and scat indicated the bear had remained in the area for some time after the attack. Following the grizzly's trail, the team discovered the carcass that had originally attracted the bear to the area. The remains of a large elk, probably a winter kill that had been recently exposed by melting snow, explained why the bear had been so aggressive in defending its feeding site. The bear itself was located approximately half a mile from the attack site, still in the vicinity of its food cache. The adult female grizzly was estimated to weigh between 350 and 400 pounds, making it one of the largest bears documented in Colorado in recent years. Wildlife Officer Tom Bradley, a 20-year veteran of dangerous animal encounters, made the decision to destroy the bear rather than attempt capture. The remote location, the animal's size and its history of attacking humans made lethal removal the only viable option for public safety. "It's never an easy decision," Bradley later told reporters, "but a bear that has attacked and seriously injured humans cannot be relocated. The risk to other people is too great." The bear was killed with a single rifle shot at 2:17 p.m. on April 19th, 2 days after the attack that had nearly claimed Jacob's life. Tissue samples were collected for analysis, including tests for diseases that might have affected the animal's behavior. Back at Denver Health Medical Center, Jacob remained in critical condition despite surviving his initial surgery. He had developed pneumonia from his chest injuries and kidney failure from the massive blood loss he had suffered. Multiple additional surgeries were required to address complications and ongoing internal bleeding. Sarah and Amanda remained at the hospital, taking turns at Jacob's bedside and trying to cope with their own psychological trauma. Both young women were experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, including nightmares, anxiety attacks, and intrusive memories of the attack. "I keep seeing it over and over," Amanda told the hospital's trauma counselor during one of her sessions. "I close my eyes and I'm back there, watching that bear tear Jacob apart. I should have done something more to help him." Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychologist specializing in trauma recovery, worked with both survivors to help them process their experience and begin the long journey towards psychological healing. The guilt and helplessness they felt were normal responses to an extraordinary situation. "You did everything you could under impossible circumstances," Williams assured Amanda. "The fact that you were able to hike out and get help probably saved Jacob's life. Without your courage, all three of you might have died in that valley." Jacob's parents, Robert and Maria Lee, arrived from their home in Phoenix on April 20th, driving through the night after receiving the devastating phone call about their son's condition. They found Jacob connected to multiple machines, his body swollen and bruised from his injuries, and the medical interventions required to keep him alive. "The doctors say the next few days are critical," Sarah explained to Jacob's parents, her voice still hoarse from crying and stress. "He's fighting so hard, but his injuries are just so severe." Maria Lee, a retired nurse, understood enough about her son's condition to recognize the gravity of the situation. The combination of massive trauma, blood loss, and organ damage had pushed Jacob's body to the very limits of what medical science could support. On April 22nd, 5 days after the attack, Jacob developed severe complications that required emergency surgery to address internal bleeding that had resumed despite previous repairs. Dr. Chang worked for 6 hours to locate and stop the bleeding, but Jacob's weakened condition made the procedure extremely risky. "His body has been through so much trauma that it's struggling to heal," Chang explained to the family after the surgery. "Every system is compromised, and we're fighting battles on multiple fronts." Sarah had not left the hospital since Jacob's arrival, sleeping in waiting room chairs and surviving on cafeteria food and the kindness of hospital staff. Her own parents had flown in from California, but she refused to leave, despite their pleas that she needed rest and time away from the intensive care unit. "I can't leave him," she told her mother. "He was hurt, protecting us. I have to be here when he wakes up." Amanda had been staying with friends in Denver, but she visited the hospital daily despite the emotional difficulty of seeing Jacob in his current condition. The young man who had been so full of life and enthusiasm just days earlier was now a shadow of himself, connected to machines that breathed for him and monitored every aspect of his failing body. Media attention around the bear attack had intensified, with national news outlets picking up the story and requesting interviews with the survivors. Sarah and Amanda declined most interview requests, but they agreed to speak with a local television station in hopes of raising awareness about wilderness safety. "People need to understand that this can happen to anyone," Sarah said during the brief interview. "We thought we were prepared. We had bear spray. We knew the safety protocols. We made noise while hiking. Sometimes that's still not enough." The interview, which aired on the evening of April 23rd, generated an outpouring of support from the community. Donations poured in to help cover Jacob's mounting medical expenses, and cards and messages of support arrived from across the country. Colorado Parks and Wildlife used the incident as an opportunity to educate the public about bear safety and the increasing presence of grizzly bears in the state. The attack highlighted the challenges of managing wildlife populations as they expanded their ranges and came into increasing contact with humans. Grizzly bears are returning to parts of Colorado where they haven't been seen for decades, explained Dr. Tomlin during a press conference. As their population recovers, encounters like this may become more common. People need to be prepared and understand the risks. On April 25th, 8 days after the attack, Jacob's condition began to stabilize slightly. His vital signs improved marginally, and doctors were cautiously optimistic that he might survive his injuries. However, the extent of permanent damage remained unknown, as Jacob had not regained consciousness. His brain activity looks good, Dr. Chang told the assembled family members. The swelling has gone down, and we're seeing more normal patterns on his EEG, but we won't know the extent of any neurological damage until he wakes up. Sarah allowed herself to feel a small measure of hope for the first time since the attack. She'd been reading to Jacob daily, playing his favorite music, and talking to him constantly despite his lack of response. The possibility that he might survive gave new meaning to her vigil at his bedside. Amanda had been working with a therapist to address her post-traumatic stress disorder, but she still struggled with feelings of guilt and responsibility for the attack. The sound of the rocks falling under her feet continued to echo in her mind, and she blamed herself for alerting the bear to their presence. "Logically, I know it wasn't my fault," she told Dr. Williams during one of their sessions. "But I keep thinking that if I had been more careful, if I hadn't made that noise, maybe none of this would have happened." The therapeutic process was complicated by the uncertainty surrounding Jacob's recovery. Amanda found it difficult to focus on her own healing, while her friend remained in critical condition, fighting for his life in the intensive care unit just floors below where they met for counseling sessions. On April 28th, 11 days after the attack, Jacob showed the first signs of returning consciousness. His eyes opened briefly in response to his mother's voice, though he showed no signs of recognition or awareness of his surroundings. "Jacob, can you hear me?" Maria Lee asked, her voice trembling with emotion as she held her son's hand. "You're in the hospital, honey. You're safe now." Jacob's eyes focused on his mother's face for a few seconds before closing again, but the brief moment of consciousness was enough to fill the room with hope. Dr. Chang cautioned that recovery from traumatic brain injury was often a lengthy and unpredictable process, but any signs of awareness were encouraging. Sarah was in the room when Jacob first opened his eyes, and she felt a surge of relief and gratitude that brought tears streaming down her face. After nearly 2 weeks of uncertainty, the possibility that Jacob might survive and recover seemed within reach. Over the following days, Jacob's periods of consciousness gradually increased, though he remained confused and disoriented. He had no memory of the attack or the events leading up to it, which doctors considered a blessing given the traumatic nature of his injuries. "Where am I?" Jacob asked weakly during one of his more lucid moments, his voice barely audible through the oxygen mask covering his face. "You're in the hospital in Denver," Sarah explained, her voice gentle but filled with emotion. "You were hurt while we were hiking, but you're going to be okay. The doctors have been taking really good care of you." Jacob's confusion was evident as he struggled to piece together fragments of memory that didn't form a coherent picture. The last thing he remembered clearly was preparing for their hiking trip, checking weather reports, and studying topographical maps in his apartment. Physical therapy began slowly as Jacob's body began the long process of healing from his massive injuries. Multiple rib fractures had healed improperly and would require additional surgery to correct. Nerve damage in his left arm had resulted in partial paralysis that might or might not improve with time and therapy. Most concerning was the cognitive impact of his injuries. Jacob's memory was severely impaired, and he struggled with basic tasks that had once been automatic. Simple conversations exhausted him, and he often became confused about where he was or what had happened to him. Recovery from injuries this severe is measured in months and years, not days and weeks, Dr. Chang explained to the family. Jacob has shown remarkable progress, just surviving the initial trauma, but he has a very long road ahead of him. Sarah made the difficult decision to take a leave of absence from school to focus on Jacob's recovery and her own psychological healing. The attack had fundamentally changed her relationship with the wilderness she had once loved, and she found herself unable to imagine returning to the mountains anytime soon. Amanda returned to classes at the University of Colorado, but struggled to concentrate on academic work while dealing with her trauma. She had developed an intense fear of open spaces and found herself unable to spend time outdoors without experiencing panic attacks. The legal implications of the attack were complex, involving questions of liability for the university outdoor recreation program, the adequacy of safety training, and the responsibilities of wilderness users. Jacob's medical expenses had already exceeded $500,000, with projections suggesting lifetime care costs could reach several million. An investigation by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration found no negligence on the part of the university or the outdoor recreation program. The students had followed established safety protocols, carried appropriate safety equipment, and made reasonable decisions based on the information available to them. This was a tragic accident, but it was not the result of negligence or inadequate preparation, the OSHA report concluded. Bear attacks, while rare, are an inherent risk of wilderness recreation that cannot be completely eliminated through safety measures. Insurance companies representing various parties began negotiations to address Jacob's medical expenses and long-term care needs. The complexity of determining liability in wilderness accidents created legal challenges that would take years to resolve fully. Public interest in the case had begun to fade as Jacob's condition stabilized and he moved from intensive care to a regular hospital room. The dramatic rescue and initial fight for survival had captured media attention, but the long, slow process of recovery was less compelling to news outlets focused on immediate stories. On May 15th, nearly 4 weeks after the attack, Jacob was transferred to a rehabilitation hospital specializing in traumatic brain injury and complex physical trauma. His cognitive function had improved gradually, but he still struggled with memory problems and concentration difficulties that made simple tasks challenging. "I remember you," Jacob told Sarah during one of her visits to the rehabilitation center, "but I can't remember hiking with you. I can't remember anything about that trip." Sarah considered this a mercy, knowing that Jacob's inability to recall the attack might spare him some of the psychological trauma that continued to plague her and Amanda. The images of that afternoon in Bear Creek Basin remained vivid in her mind, appearing unbidden during quiet moments and disrupting her sleep. Physical therapy sessions revealed the extent of damage to Jacob's body beyond the obvious injuries. His left lung had been punctured in multiple places and would never function at full capacity. Nerve damage in his torso caused chronic pain that required ongoing medication management. Most frustratingly for Jacob, who had been an avid athlete before the attack, his balance and coordination were significantly impaired. Simple tasks like walking required intense concentration, and activities that had once been automatic now demanded conscious effort and planning. "I feel like I'm living in someone else's body," Jacob confided to his physical therapist during a particularly difficult session. "Nothing works the way it should. I can't even remember how to tie my shoes without thinking about every step." The rehabilitation team working with Jacob included specialists in traumatic brain injury, physical therapy, occupational therapy, and psychology. His case had become a teaching example due to the severity and complexity of his injuries, combined with his relatively young age and previously excellent health. Amanda continued her own therapy sessions, working to address the post-traumatic stress disorder that had developed following the attack. She had returned to classes but found herself unable to concentrate on academic work, often becoming overwhelmed by intrusive memories and anxiety attacks. "I see bears everywhere," Amanda told Dr. Williams during one of their sessions. "Every dog, every large shadow, every unexpected movement triggers that same terror I felt in the mountains. I know it's not rational, but my body doesn't seem to care what my mind knows." The therapeutic process was complicated by survivors' guilt, as Amanda struggled with the fact that she had escaped the attack physically unharmed, while Jacob continued to fight for recovery. She found herself wishing she had been injured as well, feeling that her survival somehow diminished the significance of Jacob's suffering. Sarah's own therapeutic journey was different, but equally challenging. As the most experienced member of the group and the de facto leader of their hiking expedition, she felt responsible for the decisions that had led them to that remote basin where they encountered the bear. "I should have insisted we turn back when we saw the fresh tracks," Sarah told her therapist. "I should have recognized the danger signs. Jacob is paying the price for my poor judgment." Dr. Williams worked with both young women to help them understand that their survival was not something to feel guilty about, and that the attack was the result of circumstances beyond their control rather than poor decision-making. As spring turned to summer, Jacob's recovery continued at a pace that frustrated him but amazed his medical team. He had regained the ability to walk unassisted, though his gait remained unsteady and he tired easily. His memory had improved significantly, though he still had no recollection of the attack itself. "The doctors say that might be permanent," Jacob told his parents during one of their visits. "Part of me wants to remember what happened, but another part is grateful that I can't. Sarah and Amanda have to live with those memories every day." The psychological impact of the attack on the survivors had become a subject of study for researchers interested in trauma recovery. Dr. Williams had received permission from Sarah and Amanda to document their treatment as part of a larger study on wilderness trauma and its long-term effects. Media attention had largely moved on to other stories, but occasional follow-up articles appeared marking milestones in Jacob's recovery. The initial outpouring of financial support had continued steadily, helping to offset the enormous costs associated with his ongoing medical care. Colorado Parks and Wildlife had implemented new safety protocols in the wake of the attack, including enhanced warning systems for areas with recent bear activity and expanded educational programs for wilderness users. The agency had also increased funding for research into grizzly bear behavior and human-wildlife conflict prevention. This attack was a tragedy, but it's also provided valuable insights into bear behavior and wilderness safety, Dr. Tomlin explained during a presentation at a wildlife management conference. "We've learned important lessons that will help prevent similar incidents in the future." The bear population in Colorado continued to grow, with grizzlies expanding their range into areas where they hadn't been seen for decades. Wildlife officials predicted that human-bear encounters would become more common as both populations increased and more people sought outdoor recreation opportunities. By late summer, Jacob had progressed enough in his rehabilitation to begin considering his future beyond the medical system that had sustained him for months. His cognitive function had improved dramatically, though he still struggled with complex tasks and suffered from chronic fatigue that limited his daily activities. "I want to go back to school eventually," Jacob told his rehabilitation team during a planning meeting. "Maybe not environmental science anymore, but something I can handle with my current limitations. The question of returning to wilderness activities remained complicated for all three survivors. Sarah had begun taking short walks in city parks, gradually working to overcome the anxiety that plagued her in outdoor settings. Amanda had not been able to venture beyond urban environments since returning to school. Jacob's physical limitations made traditional hiking impossible, but he had begun to express interest in adapted outdoor activities that might allow him to reconnect with nature in ways that accommodated his injuries. "The mountains are still out there," Jacob said during a family visit. "Maybe I can't experience them the way I used to, but that doesn't mean I have to give up on them entirely." The legal proceedings surrounding the attack had continued throughout Jacob's recovery, with various insurance companies and legal representatives working to determine liability and compensation. The complexity of wilderness accident law made the case challenging, as traditional concepts of negligence were difficult to apply to inherently dangerous activities. A settlement was eventually reached that provided for Jacob's ongoing medical expenses and long-term care needs, though the details remained confidential. The agreement included provisions for vocational rehabilitation and adaptive equipment to help Jacob maintain as much independence as possible. As the first anniversary of the attack approached, all three survivors were dealing with the approaching date in different ways. Jacob viewed it as a milestone in his recovery journey, while Sarah and Amanda struggled with the renewed media attention and painful memories. "I don't want to be defined by what happened to us," Sarah told a reporter who contacted her about a follow-up story. "We're all working to move forward with our lives. That day in the mountains was horrible, but it's not the end of our story." Amanda had chosen not to speak with media representatives, focusing instead on her therapeutic work and gradual return to normal activities. She had changed her major from outdoor recreation to psychology, inspired by her own treatment experience and desire to help others dealing with trauma. Jacob participated in a single interview to mark the anniversary, hoping to raise awareness about wilderness safety and the importance of supporting trauma survivors. His speech was still slightly slurred from his injuries, and he tired easily during the conversation, but his determination and positive attitude were evident. "I'm grateful to be alive," Jacob said during the interview. "I'm grateful for the people who saved me, for the medical team that put me back together, and for everyone who supported us through this. I'm not the same person I was before the attack, but I'm still here, and that's what matters." The wilderness area where the attack occurred had been temporarily closed to recreational use, while wildlife officials studied bear behavior patterns and implemented new safety measures. When it reopened 6 months after the incident, new warning signs and emergency communication systems had been installed. Visitor numbers to the area remained significantly lower than previous years, as the publicity surrounding the attack had created lasting concerns about bear safety. Some outdoor recreation advocates argued that media coverage had created disproportionate fear of a relatively rare occurrence. "Thousands of people hike safely in bear country every year," noted wilderness safety expert Dr. James Patterson. "This attack was tragic, but it shouldn't prevent people from experiencing the benefits of wilderness recreation. Education and preparation are the keys to safe outdoor experiences." The Colorado outdoor recreation industry had implemented enhanced safety training programs in response to the attack, with special emphasis on bear awareness and emergency response procedures. Many outfitters and guide services now required clients to complete comprehensive safety courses before participating in backcountry activities. As Jacob, Sarah, and Amanda continued their respective journeys of recovery and healing, their experience served as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration to others facing traumatic circumstances. The attack had fundamentally changed all three lives, but it had also demonstrated the resilience of the human spirit and the power of community support in overcoming adversity. The bears continued to roam the mountains of Colorado, following ancient patterns of behavior that occasionally brought them into conflict with the humans who shared their habitat. Wildlife officials worked to minimize these encounters through education, habitat management, and monitoring programs, but they acknowledged that complete elimination of risk was impossible in truly wild places. "Wilderness is not a theme park," reminded Senior Ranger Rodriguez during a public safety presentation. "It's a place where natural processes occur without human control. That's what makes it valuable, but it's also what makes it dangerous. People who choose to venture into these places need to understand and accept the risks." The story of the bear attack in Bear Creek Basin became part of the collective memory of Colorado's outdoor recreation community, a reminder of both the beauty and danger inherent in wilderness experiences. For those who lived through it, the memories would remain vivid for the rest of their lives, shaping their relationship with the natural world in ways both profound and permanent. Jacob's recovery continued slowly but steadily, measured in small victories and gradual improvements rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Each milestone represented months of hard work and determination, supported by a medical team that had become like family and friends who had never wavered in their commitment to his healing. Sarah and Amanda's psychological recovery followed different timelines and took different forms, but both found ways to incorporate their experience into lives that remained meaningful and productive. The trauma they had experienced became part of their personal histories, influencing their choices and perspectives while not defining their entire existence. The wilderness remained, vast and indifferent to human hopes and fears, continuing to offer both inspiration and challenge to those brave enough to venture into its depths. The bears continued their ancient rhythms of survival, and hikers continued to seek the transformative experiences that only wild places could provide. In the end, the attack in Bear Creek Basin served as a powerful reminder of humanity's place in the natural world, neither master nor victim, but participant in a complex web of relationships that demanded respect, preparation, and humility from those who chose to call themselves wilderness travelers. The next stories, May 4th, 2024. Grizzly bear kills 39-year-old hiker in just 4 minutes at Glacier Park. The morning air at Logan Pass carried the crisp bite of late spring snow, deceptive in its serenity. At 6,646 feet above sea level, the Continental Divide stretched before hikers like a geological cathedral, its peaks still crowned with winter's remnants, despite the calendar's insistence that spring had arrived in Glacier National Park. Daniel Marcus Harris, 39 years old, stood at the visitor center parking lot, adjusting his Osprey day pack with the methodical precision of someone who had done this countless times before. His weathered hands, scarred from years of rock climbing and backcountry adventures, moved with practiced efficiency as he checked his gear one final time. Daniel had driven 16 hours straight from his home in Boulder, Colorado, his silver Toyota Tacoma loaded with enough equipment for a week-long solo expedition through Montana's most unforgiving wilderness. The divorce papers had been signed 3 weeks earlier, ending his 14-year marriage to Sarah and leaving him with a custody arrangement that gave him every other weekend with their twin daughters, Emma and Sophie, both 11 years old. The girls didn't understand why Daddy needed to go to the mountains to think, but Sarah knew. She recognized the hollow look in his eyes, the same expression he'd worn after his father's sudden death from a heart attack 2 years prior, the same distant stare that had preceded his previous solo trips to the Wind River Range and the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. His backpack contained the essentials of a man seeking solitude in the wilderness: a lightweight tent rated for temperatures down to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, a sleeping bag compressed into a stuff sack the size of a football, 3 days' worth of freeze-dried meals, a water filtration system, a first aid kit that hadn't been updated since his divorce proceedings began, bear spray with an expiration date still 6 months away, and a satellite communicator that he'd promised Sarah he would keep turned on at all times. The device, a Garmin InReach Mini 2, represented their compromise between his need for isolation and her maternal anxiety about the children potentially losing their father to his increasingly dangerous solo expeditions. Daniel's hiking boots, well-broken-in Salomon Quest 4 DGTX models with over 800 miles on their tread, crunched against the remnants of yesterday's sleet as he made his way toward the Hidden Lake Overlook Trail. The weather forecast had called for partly cloudy skies, with temperatures reaching the mid-40s, perfect conditions for what he intended to be a challenging but manageable day hike to scout locations for his planned backcountry camping expedition deeper into the park's interior. The National Park Service had issued the standard warnings about increased bear activity following the recent warm spell that had begun to melt the higher elevation snowpack, but Daniel had encountered black bears on numerous occasions throughout his 20 years of hiking experience and had successfully deterred a young grizzly during a backpacking trip in Yellowstone 5 years earlier using bear spray and aggressive noise-making. The parking lot at Logan Pass bustled with the controlled chaos of early-season tourism. Rangers moved between vehicles, checking permits and dispensing safety briefings to visitors whose bright, clean gear betrayed their inexperience with the park's notorious unpredictability. Daniel noticed the subtle differences in preparation between the day hikers wearing cotton clothing and carrying water bottles, and the more serious backpackers whose weathered gear and measured movements suggested familiarity with backcountry risks. A family from Minnesota argued over forgotten rain jackets while their 3 children complained about the cold wind that swept across the alpine environment with the consistency of a metronome. Ranger Patricia Michaels, 43 years old and a 15-year veteran of the Park Service, approached Daniel as he secured his truck. Her olive-green uniform bore the subtle stains of a season already marked by early wildlife encounters and tourist rescues, and her keen eyes assessed his gear with the practiced efficiency of someone who had seen too many preventable accidents. "Heading out alone today?" she asked, her tone carrying the weight of professional concern rather than casual curiosity. Daniel nodded, gesturing toward the Hidden Lake trail marker. "Planning to explore the Overlook area, maybe push a little further toward the backcountry if conditions look good." Patricia's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "We've had several grizzly sightings in that area over the past week. A sow with 2 cubs was spotted near Hidden Lake 2 days ago, and we've documented increased scat and claw marks on trees along the secondary trails. You carrying bear spray?" Daniel patted the canister secured to his belt. "Always do. And I've got experience with bears." Patricia handed him a laminated warning card. "These aren't Yellowstone tourists' bears. Glacier grizzlies are more aggressive, especially this time of year when they're emerging from hibernation and establishing territory. If you encounter one, don't run. Make yourself appear large, back away slowly, and use the spray if it approaches within 30 feet. The Hidden Lake Overlook Trail began with a deceptive gentleness, a well-maintained boardwalk system that protected the fragile alpine vegetation while providing tourists with easy access to some of the park's most spectacular views. Daniel's pace settled into the steady rhythm he had perfected over thousands of miles of mountain trails, a sustainable cadence that allowed him to cover significant distances while maintaining the energy reserves necessary for emergency situations. The elevation gain was gradual initially, rising only 400 feet over the first mile, but he knew from previous visits that the trail would become increasingly challenging as it approached the overlook's dramatic perch above Hidden Lake. Other hikers passed in both directions during the first hour of his ascent. An elderly couple from Oregon, both wearing matching REI fleece jackets and carrying trekking poles, moved with the careful deliberation of people who had learned to respect the mountains through decades of experience. They nodded to Daniel with the subtle acknowledgement that experienced hikers shared, a recognition of mutual competence and respect for the wilderness environment. Behind them, a group of college students from the University of Montana struggled with oversized backpacks and new boots that would undoubtedly produce blisters before their day concluded. Their excited chatter echoed across the alpine landscape, drawing sharp looks from more experienced hikers who understood the importance of noise discipline in bear country. The boardwalk ended after approximately 1.5 miles, transitioning to a traditional dirt trail that wound through increasingly rugged terrain. Daniel paused at the transition point to adjust his pack's weight distribution and consume one of the energy bars he had portioned for the day's nutrition. The silence that surrounded him here differed qualitatively from the quiet of lower elevations, possessing an almost crystalline quality that seemed to amplify every sound while simultaneously absorbing it into the vast emptiness of the alpine environment. His breathing created small clouds of vapor in the cold air, and he could hear his heartbeat in his ears as his cardiovascular system adapted to the reduced oxygen availability at altitude. The trail climbed more aggressively beyond the boardwalk, gaining elevation through a series of switchbacks that revealed new perspectives of the surrounding peaks with each turn. Mount Reynolds dominated the eastern horizon, its pyramid-shaped summit still shrouded in clouds that promised afternoon precipitation. To the south, the Livingston Range stretched toward the park's interior wilderness areas, where Daniel planned to establish his base camp for the week-long expedition that would take him far beyond the reach of day hikers and casual visitors. He had studied topographic maps of the region for months, identifying potential camping sites near water sources and game trails, memorizing escape routes and evacuation points should weather or injury force an early retreat. Daniel's satellite communicator chimed with an incoming message as he crested a particularly steep section of the trail. Sarah had texted, "Girls asking when you'll be back. Please check in tonight. Weather forecast shows storms moving in tomorrow." He typed a brief response confirming his safety and promising to call that evening, then returned the device to his pack's hip belt pocket. The interruption reminded him of the world beyond the mountains, of responsibilities and relationships that felt increasingly abstract with each step deeper into the wilderness. This was both the appeal and the danger of solo hiking. The complete separation from civilization's demands allowed for profound introspection and psychological healing, but it also created a vulnerability that could prove fatal when combined with poor judgment or unexpected circumstances. The grizzly bear that would end Daniel Harris's life was, at that moment, approximately 3 miles away, following a game trail that paralleled the Hidden Lake drainage system. The massive male, estimated by wildlife biologists to weigh over 800 pounds, had emerged from hibernation 6 weeks earlier in an unusually aggressive state that park rangers had attributed to the disruption of his normal territory by late-season road construction. Bear G403, as he was designated in the Park Service's tracking system, had been previously documented as one of the largest grizzlies in the northern Rocky Mountains, with a shoulder height of 42 inches and a history of aggressive encounters with humans that had resulted in 2 previous trail closures and 1 helicopter evacuation. The bear's hibernation den, located in a remote Cirque basin 12 miles from Logan Pass, had been excavated in sandy soil beneath a massive boulder that provided protection from the harsh winter conditions that regularly produced temperatures of 40 degrees below zero. During his 5-month dormancy period, G403 had lost nearly 30% of his body weight, dropping from approximately 1,100 pounds to his current 820 pounds. This dramatic weight loss had left him in a state of constant hunger that overrode many of the natural caution behaviors that typically kept wild grizzlies away from human-occupied areas. His primary diet since emergence had consisted of carrion, from winter-killed deer and elk, supplemented by the roots and shoots of early spring vegetation, but the caloric density of these food sources was insufficient to support his massive frame and aggressive territorial behavior. Dr. Rebecca Thompson, the park's chief wildlife biologist, had been tracking G403 through a combination of GPS collar data and field observations for 3 years. Her research focused on the behavioral patterns of post-hibernation grizzlies and the factors that influence their interactions with human visitors to the park. G403's movement patterns had become increasingly erratic over the past 2 weeks, with the bear traveling much greater distances than normal and spending extended periods in areas with high human activity. The GPS data from his collar showed that he had crossed the Going to the Sun Road twice in the previous week, a behavior that was extremely unusual for adult male grizzlies, who typically avoided areas with regular human traffic. Thompson's field notes from April 30th, 4 days before Daniel's fatal encounter, described G403's behavior as highly agitated and noted evidence of the bear testing human scent trails along several popular hiking routes. The bear had been observed using his powerful claws to shred the bark of trees marked with human scent, a territorial marking behavior that indicated he was claiming areas normally avoided by wild grizzlies. Most concerning was the discovery of a partially buried cache of human food items that G403 had apparently excavated from an improperly stored backpack left by previous hikers. The association between human scent and food rewards was one of the most dangerous conditioning patterns that could develop in wild bears, often leading to increasingly aggressive behavior and eventual human-bear conflicts. Daniel reached the Hidden Lake Overlook at approximately 10:30 a.m. after 2.5 hours of steady hiking. The spectacular view that greeted him justified the physical effort required to reach this vantage point. Hidden Lake stretched below him like a mirror of polished turquoise, its surface disturbed only by the occasional rise of cutthroat trout feeding on emerging insects. The surrounding Cirque walls rose nearly vertically from the lake's shores, creating a natural amphitheater that amplified the subtle sounds of the alpine environment. Daniel removed his pack and settled onto a granite boulder that had been worn smooth by countless visitors, pulling out his camera to document the scene for the photo album he maintained of his solo expeditions. The overlook hosted a steady stream of day hikers throughout the morning, creating a social dynamic that Daniel found both comforting and mildly annoying. He preferred the solitude of truly remote locations, but he appreciated the implicit safety that came with hiking in areas with regular foot traffic. A family from Texas set up an elaborate picnic on a nearby rock formation, their 3 teenage children complaining about the cold wind, while their parents attempted to coax them into posing for family photos. An older man, traveling alone, introduced himself as Robert Chen, a retired engineer from Seattle who had been visiting Glacier National Park annually for over 20 years. Chen's extensive knowledge of the area's geology and natural history made him an engaging conversation partner, and Daniel found himself lingering longer than planned while listening to stories of the park's evolution over 2 decades of changing climate and increasing visitor pressure. Chen's weather sense, developed through years of mountain experience, detected the approaching storm system before Daniel's less experienced eye recognized the subtle atmospheric changes. "Those clouds over Reynolds are building faster than the forecast predicted," Chen observed, pointing toward a grey mass that seemed to pulse with internal energy. "If I were you, I'd head back soon. These afternoon thunderstorms can be violent at this elevation, and lightning strikes are a real danger above treeline." Daniel checked his watch and realized he had been at the overlook for nearly an hour. His original plan had been to explore beyond the overlook area, possibly hiking to the shore of Hidden Lake itself or investigating the network of game trails that branched off from the main hiking route. The approaching weather complicated these plans, but Daniel had experienced mountain storms before and felt confident in his ability to navigate changing conditions. The decision that would cost Daniel his life was made with the casual confidence of someone who had successfully managed risk in the mountains for 20 years. Instead of returning directly to Logan Pass via the main trail, he chose to explore a secondary route that he had identified on topographic maps during his pre-trip planning. The trail, marked as difficult on Park Service maps and recommended only for experienced hikers, branched off from the main Hidden Lake Trail, approximately half a mile below the overlook. This route would allow him to investigate potential camping sites in a drainage system that appeared to offer both water access and protection from prevailing winds, perfect for his planned week-long expedition. Daniel said goodbye to Robert Chen at 11:45 a.m., promising to hike quickly to avoid the worst of the approaching storm. Chen later told investigators that Daniel appeared confident and well-prepared, carrying appropriate gear and demonstrating familiarity with mountain weather patterns during their conversation. "He seemed like the kind of guy who knew what he was doing," Chen recalled. "His gear was well maintained, he asked intelligent questions about route conditions, and he clearly had experience reading weather patterns. I had no concerns about his safety at that point." The secondary trail proved more challenging than Daniel had anticipated, dropping steeply through loose scree before leveling out in a narrow valley bottom filled with dense willow thickets and seasonal streams swollen with snowmelt. The vegetation was much thicker than anything visible from the overlook, creating natural corridors and blind spots that limited visibility to less than 50 feet in many areas. Daniel's progress slowed significantly as he navigated around fallen logs and seasonal wetlands, following cairns that had been placed by previous hikers, but were sometimes difficult to locate among the complex terrain features. The first sign of bear presence appeared at 12:20 p.m. in the form of a massive paw print pressed into the soft mud beside a stream crossing. Daniel knelt to examine the track, his heart rate increasing as he recognized the distinctive features that identified it as belonging to a large grizzly bear. The print measured over 6 inches in length and showed the characteristic straight claw marks that distinguish grizzly tracks from those of smaller black bears. The edges of the track were sharp and well-defined, indicating it had been made recently, possibly within the past few hours. Daniel's bear safety training, acquired through years of wilderness education and reinforced during numerous hiking expeditions, immediately activated. He straightened slowly, scanning the surrounding vegetation for any signs of movement while simultaneously checking the position of his bear spray canister. The willows that surrounded him on 3 sides created perfect cover for a large animal to approach undetected, while the stream's noise masked any sounds of movement through the undergrowth. He retrieved his satellite communicator and composed a brief message to Sarah. "Found fresh bear sign. Being extra careful. We'll check in again in 2 hours." The message transmitted successfully, creating a timestamp that would later prove crucial for search and rescue efforts. G403 had been aware of Daniel's presence for over 20 minutes, tracking the hiker's progress through the drainage system using a combination of scent detection and sound analysis. The bear's extraordinary sensory capabilities allowed him to identify individual humans from distances exceeding half a mile under favorable wind conditions, and Daniel's approach had been effectively telegraphed by the distinctive odor of synthetic outdoor clothing, chemical-based insect repellent, and the unique pheromone signature that all humans produced when experiencing moderate physical exertion. The bear's behavioral response to human presence had been fundamentally altered by his recent exposure to human food rewards, overriding the natural avoidance patterns that normally kept wild grizzlies separated from human activities. The bear's stalking behavior demonstrated the calculated intelligence that made grizzly bears one of North America's most formidable predators. Rather than approaching directly, G403 moved through the willow thickets in a wide flanking pattern that would allow him to intercept Daniel at a narrow section of the trail where the human's escape options would be limited. His massive paws made virtually no sound as they contacted the soft forest floor, and his natural coloration blended perfectly with the shadows and dappled light filtering through the dense vegetation. The bear's heart rate remained steady and controlled, indicating he was hunting rather than defending territory or cubs, a distinction that would prove irrelevant to the outcome, but was significant for understanding the attack's motivation and duration. Daniel continued following the trail markers through the increasingly complex terrain, his attention divided between navigation challenges and ongoing bear safety awareness. The recent track had heightened his alertness, but he maintained confidence in his ability to avoid dangerous encounters through proper noise discipline and situational awareness. He called out, "Hey, bear!" every 30 seconds, a technique designed to announce his presence and avoid surprising any wildlife that might be foraging in the dense vegetation. His hiking poles struck rocks and branches with deliberate force, creating additional sound that should have alerted bears to his approach from a safe distance. The attack began at 12:47 p.m. in a narrow section of trail bordered by willows on both sides and a steep slope rising to the left. Daniel had paused to check his GPS position when G403 emerged from the vegetation at a distance of approximately 15 feet, moving with the explosive speed that allows grizzly bears to accelerate from 0 to 35 miles per hour in less than 3 seconds. The bear's initial approach was silent, his massive frame parting the willow branches without creating the crashing sounds that Daniel might have expected from such a large animal moving through dense vegetation. Daniel's first awareness of the attack came from peripheral vision, a glimpse of brown fur and massive shoulders moving toward him with lethal intent. His survival instincts, honed through thousands of hours in bear country, triggered an immediate response sequence that began with an attempt to access his bear spray while simultaneously making himself appear larger by raising his hiking poles above his head. The bear spray canister, secured to his belt with a quick-release holster, caught momentarily on his pack's hip belt as Daniel struggled to draw it while backpedaling away from the approaching grizzly. Time distorted during the initial seconds of the encounter, each moment stretching into an eternity of hyper-awareness as Daniel's adrenaline-flooded nervous system processed information at an accelerated rate. The bear's eyes, small and dark against his massive head, showed no fear or uncertainty, only the focused intensity of a predator executing a calculated attack. Saliva streamed from the grizzly's open mouth as he covered the distance between them, his breathing audible as deep huffing sounds that seemed to reverberate through Daniel's chest cavity. The bear's claws, each over 4 inches in length and curved like ivory daggers, caught the filtered sunlight as they extended from massive paws capable of crushing a human skull with a single swipe. Daniel managed to clear the bear spray from its holster and trigger the safety mechanism, but the bear's speed made accurate aim impossible as G403 closed the final distance between them. The pressurized spray created an orange cloud that dispersed into the wind, missing the bear's face and eyes, while alerting every animal within a half-mile radius that a life-or-death struggle was occurring in the willows below Hidden Lake. Daniel's attempt to retreat was limited by the narrow trail and steep terrain, forcing him into a defensive position that left him vulnerable to the bear's overwhelming physical advantages. The initial contact occurred when G403's momentum carried him into Daniel with the force of a small automobile, knocking the hiker to the ground and sending his hiking poles flying into the surrounding vegetation. Daniel's backpack absorbed some of the impact, but the bear's weight, over 800 pounds of muscle, bone, and predatory intent, crushed him against the rocky trail surface with enough force to crack 2 ribs and drive the air from his lungs. The bear's claws raked across Daniel's back, shredding through his technical hiking shirt and into the skin beneath, leaving parallel furrows that immediately began bleeding profusely. Daniel's military training from his brief service in the Colorado National Guard activated survival protocols that had been drilled into his subconscious through repetitive training exercises. Rather than attempting to fight the bear directly, he rolled into a defensive position on his stomach, protecting his vital organs while using his arms to shield his neck and head from the bear's claws and teeth. This playing dead technique was recommended for grizzly bear attacks that were predatory in nature rather than defensive, though Daniel's ability to analyze the attack's motivation was severely compromised by pain, terror, and oxygen deprivation. G403's behavior during the attack demonstrated characteristics of both predatory and defensive responses, suggesting a psychological state that had been altered by his recent conditioning experiences with human food sources. Rather than delivering a quick killing bite to Daniel's neck or head, as would be typical in a predatory attack, the bear engaged in extended mauling behavior that included multiple bites to non-vital areas and aggressive shaking motions designed to disable rather than immediately kill his victim. This pattern extended the duration of the attack far beyond the typical 30-second encounters documented in most grizzly bear incidents, creating the 4-minute timeline that would later be reconstructed through analysis of Daniel's GPS tracking data and witness statements. The bear's first bite targeted Daniel's left shoulder, the grizzly's massive jaws exerting pressure measured at over 1,200 pounds per square inch, while puncturing through muscle tissue and grinding against the shoulder blade beneath. Daniel's scream echoed across the drainage system, a sound that combined physical agony with primal terror in a way that would haunt the rescue workers who later heard recordings of the attack captured by Daniel's accidentally activated voice recorder app. The bite was followed by violent shaking as G403 attempted to manipulate his victim like prey, lifting Daniel partially off the ground before releasing him and repositioning for additional attacks. Daniel's attempts to remain motionless were unsuccessful due to involuntary pain responses and the natural human tendency to struggle against mortal threat. Each movement triggered renewed aggression from G403, who interpreted any motion as either continued threat or confirmation that his prey was still viable for consumption. The bear's subsequent attacks targeted Daniel's legs and lower back, areas that would effectively immobilize the victim while keeping him alive for extended periods. This behavior pattern was consistent with documented cases of grizzly bears caching human victims for later consumption, suggesting that G403's psychological conditioning had fundamentally altered his interaction patterns with humans. Thomas Mitchell, a day hiker returning from the Hidden Lake Overlook, heard Daniel's screams from approximately 1/4 mile away at 12:49 p.m. Mitchell, a 34-year-old paramedic from Billings, Montana, immediately recognized the sounds as indicating a serious emergency and began running toward the source while simultaneously using his cell phone to attempt contact with emergency services. His location on the secondary trail system placed him beyond reliable cellular coverage, but his emergency medical training provided context for interpreting the acoustic signature of the screams that continued to echo through the valley. Mitchell's approach to the attack site was complicated by the dense vegetation and unfamiliar trail system, forcing him to navigate by sound alone while attempting to maintain his own safety in an area that clearly contained an aggressive wild animal. His emergency medical experience included previous responses to animal attacks, including 2 dog maulings and 1 incident involving a bull elk, providing him with realistic expectations about the severity of injuries he was likely to encounter. He activated his phone's video recording function while approaching, creating documentation that would later provide crucial evidence for the incident investigation and wildlife management response. The sounds of the attack changed at 12:51 p.m., shifting from Daniel's screams and the bear's huffing vocalizations to an ominous silence that Mitchell interpreted as either the conclusion of the encounter or a pause in the violence. His subsequent approach was guided by protocols designed to assess victim viability while avoiding secondary casualties, techniques that required him to balance speed of response with personal safety considerations. The GPS tracking data from Mitchell's phone would later provide precise timing information that correlated with similar data from Daniel's devices, creating a comprehensive timeline of the incident's final phases. G403's behavior during the attack's final phase demonstrated the complex psychological conditioning that had resulted from his exposure to human food sources. Rather than consuming his victim immediately or abandoning the site after establishing dominance, the bear engaged in caching behavior typically reserved for large prey items that would provide multiple meals. Using his powerful claws, G403 began excavating a shallow depression beside Daniel's motionless form, periodically pausing to sniff for signs of life and deliver additional bites to ensure the victim's incapacitation. This behavior extended the attack duration while simultaneously providing the bear with time to assess his surroundings for potential threats or competitors. Daniel's consciousness flickered in and out during the caching process, his awareness limited to fragmented impressions of pain, cold earth against his face, and the overwhelming presence of the massive animal that continued to manipulate his body with casual violence. His attempts to activate his satellite communicator's emergency beacon were unsuccessful due to blood loss and trauma-induced disorientation, though the device continued recording GPS coordinates that would prove crucial for rescue operations. The physiological effects of massive blood loss began affecting his cognitive function, creating a dreamlike state where reality blended with memory and anticipation of death. The bear's excavation efforts were interrupted by the sound of Mitchell's approach at 12:53 p.m., causing G403 to adopt a defensive posture over his cached prey while assessing the new threat. Mitchell's first glimpse of the scene came through a gap in the willow vegetation, revealing the massive grizzly standing over Daniel's motionless form in a shallow depression surrounded by disturbed earth and scattered gear. The bear's muzzle and front paws were stained with blood, while his posture indicated continued territorial aggression rather than the defensive behavior that might be expected if the attack had been motivated by surprise or cub protection. Mitchell's emergency medical training provided him with immediate recognition of the scene's lethality while simultaneously requiring him to assess potential intervention options. The bear's size and obvious aggression made direct approach impossible without weapons or additional personnel, while Daniel's motionless state suggested that time was critical for any chance of survival. Mitchell began making noise while slowly backing away from the immediate area, hoping to encourage the bear's departure while preparing to coordinate emergency response efforts from a safer distance. U-403's response to Mitchell's presence demonstrated the territorial behavior patterns that had been reinforced through his conditioning experiences with human food sources. Rather than abandoning his cached prey, the bear moved into an aggressive display posture, standing on his hind legs to assess the new threat while maintaining possession of the attack site. His vocalizations shifted from the huffing sounds associated with active hunting to the more aggressive woofing and jaw-popping sounds that grizzly bears use to warn potential competitors away from food resources. The standoff between Mitchell and G-403 lasted approximately 2 minutes, during which time Mitchell used his cell phone to attempt emergency communications while documenting the scene through video recording. His emergency medical assessment of Daniel, conducted from a distance of approximately 50 feet, suggested massive trauma with probable fatal blood loss, though the victim's position made definitive evaluation impossible. Mitchell's decision to withdraw and coordinate professional rescue response rather than attempting direct intervention likely saved his own life while establishing communication protocols that would guide subsequent emergency operations. Mitchell's retreat to an area with cellular coverage took nearly 15 minutes, during which time he maintained audio contact with the attack site to monitor any changes in the bear's behavior or Daniel's condition. The sounds that reached him suggested continued activity as G-403 resumed his caching efforts, occasionally interrupted by defensive displays triggered by sounds from other wildlife or atmospheric disturbances. By 1:10 p.m., Mitchell had reached a ridgeline that provided sufficient cellular signal strength to contact Flathead County Emergency Services and initiate the complex rescue operation that would ultimately involve over 60 personnel from multiple agencies. The initial emergency call, recorded by Flathead County Dispatch at 1:12 p.m., provided the first official notification of what would become one of the most extensively documented grizzly bear attacks in Montana history. Mitchell's report, delivered while he remained mobile to maintain cellular coverage, included precise GPS coordinates, detailed description of the bear's size and behavior, preliminary assessment of victim injuries, and evaluation of access routes for emergency responders. His professional medical background enabled him to provide information that significantly enhanced the speed and effectiveness of the rescue response, though the remote location and continued bear presence created logistical challenges that would test the limits of Montana's wilderness rescue capabilities. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the emergency room physician on duty at Kalispell Regional Medical Center, received the first notification of an incoming critical trauma case at 1:18 p.m. through the hospital's trauma alert system. Martinez, a 15-year veteran of emergency medicine with extensive experience treating wilderness injuries, began coordinating the trauma team response while reviewing protocols for massive blood loss and potential grizzly bear mauling injuries. Her preparation included activation of the hospital's blood bank reserves, notification of surgical staff, and coordination with the regional helicopter ambulance service that would be responsible for patient transport from the remote attack site. The complexity of rescuing a critical trauma victim from a location still occupied by an aggressive grizzly bear required coordination between multiple agencies with different areas of expertise and operational protocols. Glacier National Park's emergency response team, led by Chief Ranger David Thompson, assumed incident command while coordinating with Flathead County's Search and Rescue, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks personnel, and the U.S. Forest Service helicopter unit based in Missoula. Each agency brought specialized capabilities to the rescue operation, but the need for rapid coordination while maintaining personnel safety created communication challenges that would influence the timeline and ultimate outcome of the rescue effort. G403's continued presence at the attack site posed the primary obstacle to rescue operations, requiring wildlife management specialists to develop strategies for safely removing an aggressive grizzly bear from a confined area, without further endangering the victim or rescue personnel. Dr. Rebecca Thompson, the park's chief wildlife biologist, was contacted at 1:25 p.m. to provide expert consultation on bear behavior modification techniques and assessment of non-lethal removal options. Her knowledge of G403's behavioral history and conditioning patterns would prove crucial for developing safe approach protocols, though the bear's obvious territorial aggression over his cached prey suggested that non-lethal removal might not be possible. The initial rescue team, composed of 4 experienced park rangers and 2 paramedics, departed Logan Pass at 1:35 p.m. using all-terrain vehicles to reach the closest road approach to the attack site. Their equipment included advanced medical trauma supplies, bear deterrent devices, and communication systems designed to coordinate with helicopter support and additional ground teams. The team leader, Ranger Michael Stevens, had previous experience with grizzly bear incidents, but recognized that the current situation presented unique challenges due to the bear's size, aggression, and territorial behavior over the victim. Daniel's satellite communicator, still functional despite the trauma he had sustained, continued transmitting GPS coordinates and limited biometric data throughout the rescue operation. The device's emergency monitoring service, based in Texas, had been automatically notified when Daniel failed to respond to periodic check-in prompts, initiating their own contact with emergency services to provide additional information about the victim's identity and emergency contacts. This coordination resulted in notification of Daniel's ex-wife Sarah at 1:42 p.m., providing her with preliminary information about the incident while requesting additional medical history information that might be relevant for treatment planning. Sarah Harris received the emergency notification while at work at her accounting firm in Boulder, Colorado. The call from Glacier National Park's emergency coordinator provided only essential information about Daniel's condition and location, but Sarah's intimate knowledge of her ex-husband's hiking patterns allowed her to provide crucial background information about his medical history, emergency contacts, and expedition planning. Her immediate response included arranging emergency childcare for their twin daughters while coordinating travel to Montana, though the uncertainty about Daniel's survival made planning extremely difficult from both logistical and emotional perspectives. The helicopter insertion team, operating a Bell UH-1H from the Montana National Guard, encountered significant weather challenges during their approach to the attack site. The storm system that Robert Chen had identified from the Hidden Lake overlook had continued developing throughout the afternoon, creating wind conditions and visibility restrictions that complicated precision flying in the mountainous terrain surrounding the incident location. Pilot Captain James Rodriguez, with over 2,000 hours of mountain rescue experience, made 3 approach attempts before determining that safe landing near the attack site would require coordination with ground teams to establish an appropriate landing zone. Ground team arrival at the attack site occurred at 2:15 p.m., approximately 1 hour and 28 minutes after the initial attack. The team's approach was guided by GPS coordinates and Mitchell's continued radio communication from his observation position, allowing them to navigate the complex trail system while maintaining awareness of potential bear locations. Their first priority was establishing visual contact with both the victim and G403 to assess the current situation and determine appropriate intervention strategies. Ranger Stevens' initial assessment of the scene confirmed Mitchell's reports about the bear's territorial behavior and Daniel's critical condition. G403 remained within 50 feet of the cached victim, displaying aggressive posture and vocalizations that indicated he would actively defend his food source against any approach attempts. Daniel appeared unconscious and motionless, with visible massive trauma and blood loss that suggested his condition was critical or potentially fatal. The bear's behavior patterns showed no indication of natural departure, requiring active intervention to access the victim. Dr. Thompson arrived with the ground team and immediately began analyzing G403's behavioral displays to determine the most effective approach for bear removal. Her assessment indicated that the bear's conditioning with human food sources had fundamentally altered his natural response patterns, making standard deterrent techniques potentially ineffective or even counterproductive. The bear's size and obvious physical condition suggested that even successful deterrent application might not result in immediate departure, creating extended risk exposure for rescue personnel attempting to access the victim. The decision to use lethal force against G403 was made at 2:28 p.m. after consultation between Incident Command, wildlife management specialists, and medical personnel. The bear's territorial aggression, combined with his history of human food conditioning and the immediate threat to rescue operations, left no viable alternatives for safely accessing the critically injured victim. Ranger Stevens, qualified as an expert marksman with extensive experience in wildlife management situations, was designated to take the shot using a .30-6 rifle with ammunition specifically selected for large bear incapacitation. The shot that killed G403 was fired at 2:31 p.m. from a distance of approximately 75 yards, striking the bear in the chest cavity and causing immediate incapacitation. The bear's death was instantaneous, eliminating the territorial threat while allowing rescue personnel to reach Daniel for medical assessment and emergency treatment. Stevens' accuracy under extreme pressure conditions reflected years of training and experience, though the necessity of destroying such a magnificent animal created emotional complexity that would affect all personnel involved in the incident. Paramedic Jennifer Walsh reached Daniel at 2:33 p.m., beginning emergency medical assessment and treatment protocols for massive trauma and blood loss. Her initial evaluation revealed multiple puncture wounds, extensive tissue damage, and signs of severe hypovolemic shock that indicated critical blood loss. Daniel's vital signs were barely detectable, with a weak pulse rate of over 120 beats per minute and blood pressure readings that suggested imminent cardiovascular collapse. Walsh immediately initiated intravenous fluid replacement therapy while requesting urgent helicopter evacuation for advanced trauma care. The medical assessment revealed the full extent of Daniel's injuries, which included massive soft tissue damage to his shoulder, back and legs, multiple puncture wounds from the bear's claws and teeth, 2 fractured ribs, and evidence of internal bleeding that would require immediate surgical intervention. Walsh's field treatment focused on hemorrhage control and IV fluid support to maintain blood pressure during transport, though Daniel's condition suggested that survival would depend on reaching advanced medical care within the critical golden hour for trauma treatment. Daniel regained consciousness briefly during the initial medical treatment, displaying confusion and severe pain responses that indicated both the trauma's psychological and physical impact. His attempts to communicate were limited to fragmented words and phrases that reflected disorientation and possible traumatic brain injury from blood loss and shock. Walsh administered pain medication and continued supportive care while coordinating with the helicopter crew for immediate evacuation to Kalispell Regional Medical Center. The helicopter extraction occurred at 2:47 p.m. under challenging weather conditions that required exceptional piloting skill to safely remove Daniel from the mountainous terrain. Captain Rodriguez executed a precision approach that allowed medical personnel to transfer the patient directly into the aircraft's medical bay, where flight paramedic Robert Anderson continued advanced life support during the 20-minute flight to the hospital. Daniel's vital signs remained critically unstable throughout the transport, with continued blood loss and signs of developing shock that indicated the severity of his condition. Dr. Martinez received Daniel in the Kalispell Regional Trauma Bay at 3:12 p.m., immediately initiating massive transfusion protocols designed to replace lost blood volume while preparing for emergency surgery. Her initial assessment confirmed field reports of massive trauma with life-threatening blood loss, requiring immediate surgical intervention to control internal bleeding and repair damaged tissue. The trauma team included orthopedic surgeon Dr. Michael Chang, vascular surgeon Dr. Patricia Williams, and anesthesiologist Dr. Kevin Brown, all specialists with experience treating severe wildlife attack injuries. The surgical procedure, which began at 3:35 p.m., revealed even more extensive internal damage than initial assessments had suggested. G403's claws had penetrated Daniel's abdominal cavity, causing liver lacerations and damage to major blood vessels that required complex repair techniques. The bear's teeth had created massive soft tissue wounds that demanded extensive debridement and reconstruction, while the blunt force trauma from the bear's weight had caused additional internal injuries that complicated the surgical approach. Dr. Chang's repair of Daniel's fractured ribs and damaged shoulder required insertion of titanium plates and screws to stabilize the bone fragments that had been crushed during the bear's initial attack. The complexity of the orthopedic injuries suggested that Daniel would face months of rehabilitation even if he survived the immediate medical crisis, with permanent disability likely affecting his ability to return to his previous level of physical activity. The psychological trauma associated with such a severe wildlife attack would require additional treatment resources that extended far beyond the immediate medical intervention. Sarah Harris arrived at Kalispell Regional Medical Center at 6:45 p.m., having driven continuously from Boulder while receiving updates about Daniel's condition through the hospital's family liaison service. Her reunion with her ex-husband occurred in the intensive care unit, where Daniel remained unconscious and connected to multiple life support systems that monitored his vital signs and supported his damaged cardiovascular system. The sight of his extensive injuries and medical equipment created emotional trauma for Sarah that would require counseling support for months afterward. Daniel's condition remained critical but stable throughout his first night in intensive care, with medical staff maintaining continuous monitoring for signs of infection, additional internal bleeding, or organ failure that could prove fatal despite successful surgical intervention. Dr. Martinez explained to Sarah that Daniel's survival depended on his body's ability to recover from massive blood loss while fighting potential infections from the numerous puncture wounds created by G403's claws and teeth. The bear's mouth and claws typically carried bacteria that could cause life-threatening infections even in successfully treated trauma cases. The investigation into the circumstances surrounding Daniel's attack began on May 5th, led by Special Agent Maria Rodriguez from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in coordination with Glacier National Park law enforcement personnel. Rodriguez's expertise in wildlife attack investigations would prove crucial for understanding the factors that contributed to G403's aggressive behavior and determining whether park management protocols required modification to prevent similar incidents. Her preliminary assessment focused on the bear's conditioning history, Daniel's adherence to bear safety protocols, and environmental factors that might have influenced the encounter's outcome. G403's necropsy, performed by Dr. Thompson and state wildlife veterinarian Dr. James Peterson, revealed significant information about the bear's physical condition and behavioral motivation during the attack. The bear's stomach contents included remains of human food items, consistent with camping and hiking supplies, confirming that G403 had been conditioned to associate human presence with food rewards. This conditioning likely overrode the bear's natural avoidance of human contact and contributed to his willingness to approach Daniel aggressively rather than avoiding the encounter. The physical examination of G403's carcass revealed a bear in exceptional physical condition despite his recent emergence from hibernation, with muscle mass and bone density measurements that placed him among the largest grizzly bears documented in the northern Rocky Mountains. His claws, measuring over 4 inches in length, showed wear patterns consistent with extensive digging and territorial marking behavior, while his teeth displayed the characteristic wear associated with an omnivorous diet, supplemented by significant quantities of hard materials. The bear's exceptional size and physical condition likely contributed to the severity of Daniel's injuries and the extended duration of the attack. Daniel's recovery process began with his emergence from medically induced coma on May 8th, 4 days after the attack. His initial consciousness was characterized by severe confusion, memory gaps, and psychological trauma symptoms that required immediate psychiatric intervention in addition to continued medical treatment. Dr. Lisa Thompson, a psychiatrist specializing in trauma recovery, began working with Daniel to address the post-traumatic stress symptoms that commonly developed following severe wildlife attacks, particularly encounters with large predators that created lasting fear responses. The physical rehabilitation required for Daniel's recovery would extend for over 18 months, involving multiple surgical procedures to repair nerve damage and restore function to his damaged limbs. Physical therapist Michael Johnson, who specialized in wildlife attack recovery cases, estimated that Daniel's mobility would be permanently affected by the extent of his injuries, particularly the damage to his shoulder and back that had resulted from G403's claws and teeth. The psychological aspects of recovery would prove even more challenging than the physical rehabilitation, requiring extensive counseling support and gradual exposure therapy to address Daniel's developing fear of outdoor environments. Media coverage of the incident began on May 5th with initial reports from local television stations and newspapers, eventually expanding to national coverage as details about the attack's severity and the bear's exceptional size became public knowledge. The story's appeal to national media reflected both the dramatic nature of the encounter and public fascination with human-wildlife conflict in America's national parks. Environmental reporter Jessica Martinez from CNN interviewed Daniel's doctors, rescue personnel, and park officials to provide comprehensive coverage that balanced accurate information with respect for the victim's privacy. The broader implications of Daniel's attack extended beyond individual tragedy to raise questions about bear management policies in Glacier National Park and the effectiveness of current protocols for protecting visitors from increasingly aggressive wildlife. Environmental groups argued that human encroachment into bear habitat created inevitable conflicts that could only be resolved through more restrictive access policies, while recreation advocates maintained that proper education and safety protocols were sufficient to manage risk for responsible outdoor enthusiasts like Daniel. Dr. Thompson's research into G403's behavioral conditioning became part of a comprehensive study examining the factors that contributed to aggressive human-bear encounters in national parks throughout the Rocky Mountain region. Her findings suggested that climate change impacts on traditional food sources, combined with increasing human visitation to remote areas, created conditions that promoted dangerous conditioning patterns in individual bears. The research would influence policy recommendations for bear management throughout the national park system, potentially affecting access and safety protocols for millions of future visitors. Daniel's legal consideration of potential claims against the National Park Service for inadequate warning about G403's presence in the Hidden Lake area created complex questions about government liability for wildlife attacks in public lands. Attorney David Mitchell, who specialized in federal tort claims, explained that proving negligence in wildlife management cases required demonstrating that park officials knew or should have known about specific risks that were not adequately communicated to visitors. The investigation into Park Service knowledge of G403's conditioning and aggressive behavior patterns would determine whether Daniel had grounds for legal action. The financial impact of Daniel's attack extended far beyond his immediate medical expenses, which exceeded $200,000 during the first month of treatment. His inability to work as a software engineer during his extended recovery period created additional economic hardship for both Daniel and his ex-wife Sarah, who assumed increased responsibility for supporting their twin daughters while coordinating Daniel's care. The family's health insurance coverage, while comprehensive, included deductibles and coverage limitations that created significant out-of-pocket expenses for specialized treatments and long-term rehabilitation services. 1 year after the attack, Daniel Harris returned to the Hidden Lake area for the first time, accompanied by a trauma counselor and Park Service personnel as part of his recovery process. The visit, designed to help him process the traumatic memories while reducing his developing aversion to outdoor environments, required extensive preparation and safety protocols to ensure his psychological well-being. Dr. Lisa Thompson explained that many wildlife attack survivors experienced lasting fear responses that could prevent them from enjoying outdoor activities that had previously been central to their identity and mental health. Daniel's daughters, Emma and Sophie, required their own counseling support to process their father's near-death experience and the lasting changes in his physical capabilities and emotional state. Child psychologist Dr. Rebecca Johnson worked with the girls to help them understand their father's injuries and recovery process, while addressing their own fears about outdoor activities and wildlife encounters. The family dynamics continued evolving throughout Daniel's recovery as everyone adapted to the permanent changes created by his encounter with G403. The memorial plaque installed at Logan Pass to commemorate the incident and honor the rescue personnel who saved Daniel's life became a symbol of both the risks and rewards associated with wilderness recreation. The memorial's inscription, approved by the National Park Service after consultation with Daniel and his family, recognized the courage of Thomas Mitchell, the rescue personnel who risked their lives during the operation, and the complex relationship between human visitors and the wild animals that call Glacier National Park their home. The memorial serves as a reminder that wilderness recreation, while providing profound personal benefits, requires respect for natural forces that remain fundamentally beyond human control. Daniel's gradual return to outdoor activities, beginning with short walks on paved trails and eventually progressing to day hikes in areas with minimal wildlife risk, demonstrated the human capacity for resilience and adaptation following traumatic experiences. His recovery process became a case study for trauma specialists working with other wildlife attack survivors, providing insights into effective treatment approaches and the factors that contributed to successful long-term adjustment. While Daniel would never again attempt the type of remote solo expeditions that had previously defined his relationship with wilderness areas, he discovered new ways to connect with natural environments that honored both his need for outdoor experiences and the realistic assessment of risk that his encounter with G403 had permanently embedded in his consciousness. The ripple effects of Daniel's attack continued influencing bear management policies, visitor education programs, and wilderness safety protocols throughout the Rocky Mountain region, creating a legacy that extended far beyond the 4 minutes of terror he experienced in the willows below Hidden Lake. His survival and recovery served as testimony to both human fragility and resilience when confronted with the awesome power of wild nature, while G403's death symbolized the tragic consequences when wildlife conditioning and human activities intersect in ways that compromise the natural balance between species that have shared these mountain ecosystems for millennia. The story of Daniel Harris and G403 remains embedded in the institutional memory of Glacier National Park, influencing training programs for rangers and rescue personnel while serving as a sobering reminder of the responsibilities that accompany wilderness management in one of America's most spectacular and dangerous natural environments. The lessons learned from this encounter continue shaping policies and procedures designed to protect both human visitors and the wild animals that make these mountain landscapes unique, ensuring that future generations can safely experience the profound beauty and inherent risks that define authentic wilderness recreation in the modern era. The next stories. April 9th, 2025, polar bear breaks into Arctic Research Station, injures 11 adults. The wind howled across the barren expanse of Karnak, Greenland, carrying with it the bitter promise of another brutal Arctic night. Dr. Sarah Mitchell pressed her face against the reinforced glass of the observation window, watching ice crystals form intricate patterns as her breath fogged the surface. The Thule Arctic Research Station stood like a metallic island amid an ocean of white, its modular buildings connected by enclosed walkways that swayed gently in the relentless polar wind. At 34, Sarah had dedicated her career to studying climate change in the Arctic, but nothing in her 8 years of polar research had prepared her for what would unfold in the next 18 hours. The station, officially designated as Thule 7, had been operational for 12 years, serving as a critical outpost for international climate research. Its location, approximately 850 miles from the North Pole, made it one of the northernmost permanently inhabited research facilities on Earth. The complex consisted of 6 interconnected modules: the main laboratory, living quarters, communication center, equipment storage, emergency shelter, and the recently added Visitor Orientation Center. Each building was constructed with triple insulated walls and reinforced against the extreme conditions, designed to withstand temperatures as low as -60 degrees Fahrenheit and wind speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. Dr. Marcus Chen, the station's 42-year-old atmospheric physicist and acting director, reviewed the daily weather reports in his cramped office adjacent to the main lab. The meteorological data painted a concerning picture. A massive storm system was approaching from the northwest, promising to bring winds of up to 90 miles per hour and temperatures that would plummet to -45 degrees. Marcus had weathered dozens of such storms during his 6 years at Thule 7, but something about this one felt different. The satellite imagery showed an unusual pattern in the cloud formations, and the barometric pressure readings had been fluctuating erratically for the past 72 hours. The research team currently stationed at Thule 7 represented an international collaboration of scientists and support personnel. Dr. Elena Volkov, a 38-year-old Russian marine biologist, had arrived 3 weeks earlier to study the impact of climate change on Arctic seal populations. Her work required her to venture onto the sea ice regularly, often accompanied by Nyack Tutu, a 51-year-old Inuit guide whose knowledge of the local terrain and wildlife was invaluable. Nyack had been born and raised in the region, his family having lived in the area for generations. His weathered face told the story of countless expeditions across the tundra, and his dark eyes held the wisdom that came from a lifetime of reading the subtle signs of the Arctic environment. Dr. James Patterson, a 29-year-old glaciologist from the University of Edinburgh, had joined the team 6 months ago to conduct ice core analysis. His youthful enthusiasm often clashed with the more seasoned researchers, but his innovative techniques for ice dating had already yielded significant results. James shared the cramped living quarters with Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a 35-year-old Japanese seismologist who had been monitoring tectonic activity in the region. Her sensitive instruments had been detecting unusual vibrations beneath the ice sheet, patterns that didn't match typical geological activity. The support staff was equally international and dedicated. Maria Santos, a 28-year-old communications specialist from Brazil, maintained the station's vital link to the outside world through an array of satellite dishes and radio equipment. Her cheerful demeanor and fluent command of multiple languages made her popular among the research team, though she often struggled with the isolation and extreme conditions. Carl Lindberg, a 45-year-old Swedish engineer, kept the station's complex systems running smoothly. His expertise with Arctic-rated equipment had saved the station from numerous potential disasters, from frozen water lines to generator failures. Dr. Robert Hayes, a 60-year-old veteran polar researcher from Canada, served as the team's medical officer and emergency coordinator. His 3 decades of experience in remote locations had taught him to prepare for every conceivable crisis, though he privately worried about the station's increasing isolation as climate change altered traditional ice routes. Dr. Hayes maintained a well-stocked medical facility within the station, equipped to handle everything from minor injuries to major trauma, but he knew that serious cases would require evacuation to Thule Air Base, weather permitting. The visiting delegation that had arrived the previous day added complexity to the station's dynamics. Dr. Amanda Foster, a 41-year-old documentary filmmaker and environmental journalist from the BBC, had come to produce a feature on Arctic research for an upcoming climate change series. Her camera operator, Thomas Brennan, a 33-year-old Irishman with extensive experience in extreme environments, had already begun capturing the stark beauty and harsh realities of life at the station. Dr. Foster's presence introduced an element of scrutiny that made some team members uncomfortable, particularly when she began asking pointed questions about safety protocols and emergency procedures. The final visitor was Dr. Erik Haugen, a 47-year-old Norwegian polar bear specialist who had arrived to assess the increasing frequency of bear encounters in the region. His timing proved tragically prescient. Dr. Haugen had spent the better part of 2 decades studying polar bear behavior, tracking migration patterns, and documenting the species' adaptation to changing ice conditions. His weathered hands bore scars from a bear encounter 15 years earlier, a reminder of the power and unpredictability of the Arctic's apex predator. The morning of April 8th began with routine activities. The research team gathered in the main laboratory at 0700 hours for their daily briefing, a ritual that had become second nature over the months they had worked together. Dr. Chen reviewed the weather forecast, noting the approaching storm system and implementing preliminary preparations for a potential lockdown. The station's emergency protocols were comprehensive, developed through years of experience and refined after each significant weather event. When storms of sufficient magnitude approached, all outdoor activities ceased, and the team would remain sealed within the interconnected modules until conditions improved. Dr. Volkov presented her findings from the previous day's ice observations, describing concerning changes in seal behavior that suggested disruptions to their feeding patterns. The seals, she explained, seemed to be avoiding traditional haul-out sites, clustering instead in areas that offered better protection from predators. This behavioral shift had significant implications for the region's polar bear population, as seals represented their primary food source. Dr. Haugen listened intently, recognizing the patterns Dr. Volkov described as consistent with his own observations of increasingly desperate bear behavior. The morning progressed with each team member attending to their specialized tasks. Dr. Patterson collected ice core samples from the storage freezer, preparing them for analysis using the station's sophisticated spectrometry equipment. Dr. Tanaka monitored her seismic instruments, noting continued unusual activity beneath the ice sheet. The readings suggested movement patterns that didn't correspond to known geological phenomena, creating an underlying tension that she couldn't quite articulate. Maria Santos maintained the communication schedule with Thule Air Base, conducting the mandatory twice-daily check-ins that served as the station's lifeline to the outside world. The radio signals had been experiencing unusual interference over the past week, requiring multiple attempts to establish clear contact. The interference patterns didn't match typical atmospheric disturbances, leading Maria to suspect equipment malfunction or possible solar activity affecting satellite communications. By midday, the approaching storm had begun to make its presence felt. The wind speed had increased to 45 miles per hour, and the temperature had dropped to -32 degrees Fahrenheit. Dr. Chen made the decision to initiate Stage 1 emergency protocols, which included securing all exterior equipment, checking the integrity of the intermodule walkways, and ensuring that emergency supplies were readily accessible. The team moved with practiced efficiency, each member knowing their specific responsibilities in storm preparation. Dr. Hayes conducted a thorough inventory of the medical supplies, ensuring that trauma kits were positioned strategically throughout the complex. His years of experience had taught him that storms often brought unexpected injuries as people rushed to secure equipment or became careless in their haste. The medical bay, located in the central module, contained sophisticated emergency equipment, including a portable surgical suite, blood plasma, and a range of medications suitable for treating everything from hypothermia to severe trauma. The afternoon brought increasingly violent weather conditions. Wind gusts reached 65 miles per hour, causing the interconnected walkways to flex and creak ominously. The station's structural integrity remained sound, but the constant movement and noise created an atmosphere of barely controlled chaos. Dr. Foster and Thomas Brennan took advantage of the dramatic conditions to film segments for their documentary, capturing the raw power of the Arctic storm and the team's professional response to the emergency situation. As evening approached, the full fury of the storm descended upon Thule 7. Wind speeds exceeded 80 miles per hour, and the temperature plummeted to -41 degrees Fahrenheit. The station's exterior was completely obscured by blowing snow, creating a whiteout condition that rendered visibility virtually zero. The team gathered in the main laboratory, which served as the designated storm shelter, to wait out the worst of the weather. Dr. Haugen used the enforced confinement to share his knowledge of polar bear behavior with the assembled group. He explained how severe storms could drive bears to seek shelter in unexpected places, sometimes bringing them into dangerous proximity to human habitations. His presentation was both educational and ominous, describing instances where desperate bears had attempted to break into research stations, military installations, and even aircraft. The bears' incredible strength, combined with their intelligence and adaptability, made them capable of overcoming many human-designed barriers. The polar bears in the region, Dr. Haugen explained, were facing unprecedented challenges as climate change altered their traditional hunting grounds. The sea ice was forming later in the year and breaking up earlier, reducing the time available for the bears to hunt seals. This compressed hunting season forced the bears to travel greater distances and take greater risks in their search for food. Pregnant females were particularly vulnerable as they needed to accumulate sufficient fat reserves to survive the denning period and nurse their cubs. As the night progressed, the storm reached its peak intensity. The station's structure groaned under the assault of wind and ice, but the engineering held firm. The team members tried to maintain normal routines despite the circumstances, sharing meals, continuing their research work where possible, and engaging in conversation to pass the time. The enforced intimacy of storm confinement had created strong bonds among the research team over the months, but the presence of outsiders changed the dynamics subtly. Dr. Foster conducted informal interviews with team members, gathering material for her documentary, while simultaneously probing the underlying tensions and stresses of life in such an extreme environment. Her questions revealed the psychological toll that isolation and constant danger exacted on even the most experienced polar researchers. Dr. Chen found himself growing increasingly irritated by her persistent inquiries, particularly when she questioned the adequacy of the station's safety measures. The storm continued through the night, its intensity fluctuating, but never fully abating. The team took turns maintaining watches, monitoring weather conditions, and checking the station's systems for any signs of damage or malfunction. Carl Lindbergh made regular rounds of the mechanical spaces, ensuring that the heating systems continued to function properly and that the backup generators remained operational. The failure of either system during such conditions would create a life-threatening situation within hours. Dr. Tanaka's seismic equipment continued to register unusual activity throughout the night, patterns that seemed to intensify in correlation with the storm's fury. She privately wondered whether the extreme weather might be triggering some form of geological response, though she kept her concerns to herself to avoid adding to the general anxiety. The instruments showed movement beneath the ice that suggested large-scale shifting, possibly indicating changes in the underlying permafrost or bedrock. Morning arrived with little fanfare, the storm having maintained its intensity throughout the night. April 9th dawned grey and hostile, with continued high winds and temperatures that remained dangerously low. The team's morning briefing was subdued, with Dr. Chen reporting that the Weather Service predicted the storm would continue for at least another 18 to 24 hours. The extended duration meant that the team would remain in lockdown mode, with all outdoor activities suspended indefinitely. The psychological pressure of confinement began to show among the team members. Small irritations became magnified, and the normally cordial relationships showed signs of strain. Dr. Patterson complained loudly about the delay to his research schedule, while Dr. Volkov expressed concern about missing critical observation windows for her seal population study. The visitors, unaccustomed to the rhythms of polar research, seemed particularly affected by the enforced inactivity. Maria Santos reported increasing difficulty in maintaining communication with the outside world, with radio signals becoming increasingly intermittent and satellite links failing repeatedly. The communication problems were attributed to the extreme weather conditions, but they added another layer of isolation and anxiety to the already tense situation. The twice-daily check-ins with Thule Air Base became exercises in frustration, with messages often requiring multiple transmissions to get through. By mid-morning, The seismic activity detected by Dr. Tanaka's instruments had increased significantly. The patterns suggested movement that was both massive in scale and disturbingly close to the station's location. She finally approached Dr. Chen with her concerns, sharing the data that showed what appeared to be regular rhythmic disturbances in the ice sheet. The timing and frequency of the signals didn't match any known geological phenomena, leading to speculation about their cause. Dr. Haugen, upon reviewing Dr. Tanaka's seismic data, proposed a disturbing alternative explanation. The regular patterns and proximity to the station suggested the possibility of large animal movement, specifically the kind of repetitive behavior exhibited by polar bears seeking shelter or investigating potential food sources. His interpretation of the data sent a chill through the assembled team that had nothing to do with the Arctic temperature. The concept that a polar bear might be in the vicinity of the station during such extreme weather conditions was both fascinating and terrifying. Dr. Haugen explained that bears possessed remarkable abilities to detect sheltered areas and human activity, even across considerable distances. Their sense of smell was legendary, capable of detecting seals beneath several feet of snow and ice. The sense emanating from a research station, food, fuel, human presence, would be detectable by a bear from miles away, even in storm conditions. As the day progressed, the seismic readings became increasingly pronounced and localized. Dr. Tanaka's instruments were now detecting disturbances that appeared to originate from directly beneath or very near the station itself. The regular pattern of the signals suggested systematic behavior, as if something was moving around the station's perimeter in a deliberate reconnaissance pattern. Dr. Haugen's expression grew increasingly grave as he studied the data, recognizing behavioral patterns that he had observed in polar bears conducting territorial assessments. The team's anxiety reached a new level when Carl Lindberg reported unusual sounds coming from the station's exterior walls during his routine system checks. The sounds, which he described as irregular scraping and impact noises, couldn't be attributed to storm damage or structural movement. When combined with the seismic data, they painted a picture of something large and powerful investigating the station from outside. Dr. Chen ordered all team members to remain in the central areas of the complex, away from exterior walls and windows. Dr. Hayes began preparing the medical bay for potential emergency treatment, though he privately hoped his preparations would prove unnecessary. His experience in remote locations had taught him that dangerous situations often escalated rapidly, and the best response was proactive preparation. He inventoried trauma supplies, prepared intravenous fluids, and reviewed emergency procedures with Maria Santos, who had received basic medical training as part of her communications role. The afternoon brought an escalation in both the storm's intensity and the mysterious disturbances around the station. The seismic readings now showed almost constant activity, suggesting that whatever was outside had become increasingly agitated or determined. Dr. Haugen shared his assessment that they were likely dealing with a large male polar bear, possibly one that had been displaced by the storm and was seeking shelter. Male polar bears could weigh up to 1,500 pounds and possessed incredible strength, capable of breaking through materials that would stop most other animals. The team's discussion of potential responses revealed the limited options available in such a situation. The station's design prioritized protection from weather rather than defense against wildlife, though basic precautions had been incorporated. The exterior doors were reinforced and equipped with heavy-duty locking mechanisms, and the windows were constructed of thick, impact-resistant materials. However, these measures were intended to deter curious bears rather than stop a determined adult male. Dr. Foster and Thomas Brennan began documenting the unfolding situation, recognizing its potential significance for their documentary. The presence of a polar bear at the station during such extreme weather conditions provided compelling footage of the intersection between human activity and wildlife behavior in the Arctic. However, their filming activities were restricted to interior locations, as approaching exterior windows or doors was deemed too dangerous. As evening approached, the sounds from outside became more pronounced and systematic. Carl Lindberg reported what appeared to be testing behavior, with impacts occurring at various points around the station's perimeter. The pattern suggested intelligence and purpose, as if the bear was probing for weak points or entry opportunities. Dr. Haugen explained that such behavior was typical of polar bears investigating new territories or potential food sources, but the persistence and duration of the activity was unusual. The team's dinner was a subdued affair, with conversation focused on contingency planning and emergency procedures. Dr. Chen reviewed the station's evacuation protocols, though he acknowledged that the current weather conditions made any exterior movement extremely dangerous. The emergency shelter, located in a separate building connected by an enclosed walkway, could provide temporary refuge, but reaching it would require crossing exposed areas that a bear could easily intercept. The night shift rotation was reorganized to ensure continuous monitoring of both the weather conditions and the apparent bear activity outside. Dr. Patterson and Dr. Tanaka volunteered for the first watch, positioning themselves in the communications center, where they could monitor the seismic equipment and maintain contact with Thule Air Base if conditions permitted. The remainder of the team settled into the main laboratory for the night, following emergency protocols that kept everyone in the most secure area of the complex. Around 2,200 hours, the situation took a dramatic turn. Dr. Patterson reported a sudden increase in seismic activity, coinciding with loud impact sounds from the direction of the Visitor Orientation Center. The pattern suggested that the bear had located what it perceived as a viable entry point and was beginning more aggressive investigation. Dr. Haugen's face went pale as he listened to the description, recognizing the escalation from reconnaissance to active penetration attempt. The Visitor Orientation Center had been the most recent addition to the station complex, constructed to accommodate the increasing number of scientific visitors and media personnel. Its design prioritized comfort and accessibility over security, making it potentially the most vulnerable point in the station's defenses. The building housed sleeping quarters for visitors, a small kitchen facility, and a presentation area equipped with multimedia equipment for briefings and educational programs. Carl Lindberg volunteered to conduct a reconnaissance of the threatened building, despite the obvious dangers involved. His knowledge of the station's layout and structural weaknesses made him the logical choice for such a mission, though Dr. Chen was reluctant to authorize any movement that might expose team members to attack. The debate was resolved when the impact sounds increased in frequency and intensity, suggesting that the bear's efforts were becoming more focused and effective. Equipped with a portable radio and emergency flares, Carl made his way through the enclosed walkway connecting the main complex to the visitor center. The walkway provided some protection from both the weather and potential bear encounter, but its construction was lighter than the main buildings, designed more for convenience than security. Carl's progress was monitored via radio, with the entire team listening to his whispered reports as he approached the threatened building. Carl's initial assessment confirmed the team's worst fears. The bear had indeed focused its attention on the visitor center, apparently having identified vulnerabilities in the building's construction that had escaped human detection. Large sections of insulation had been torn away from the exterior walls, and several windows showed signs of impact damage. Most disturbingly, Carl reported evidence that the bear had been systematically testing different entry points, showing a level of problem-solving that exceeded normal wildlife behavior. The discovery that prompted the most concern was damage to the emergency exit door on the building's north side. The heavy-duty locking mechanism had been partially compromised, with claw marks and impact damage visible on both the door and frame. Carl's assessment suggested that the bear had nearly succeeded in forcing entry and that continued efforts would likely result in a breach. The team now faced the terrifying prospect of a polar bear gaining access to the station complex, while extreme weather conditions prevented any possibility of evacuation or outside assistance. Dr. Chen made the difficult decision to abandon the visitor center entirely, implementing emergency protocols that sealed the walkway connections and isolated the building from the main complex. This action sacrificed the visitor quarters and equipment, but potentially prevented the bear from gaining access to areas where the team was sheltering. The psychological impact of essentially surrendering part of their facility to the bear was significant, creating a sense that they were under siege. The team's night was spent in anxious vigilance, with rotating watches, monitoring both the abandoned visitor center and the main complex for signs of bear activity. The seismic readings showed continued movement around the perimeter, but the focus had indeed shifted to the isolated building. Dr. Haugen speculated that the bear's success in compromising the visitor center might satisfy its immediate needs for shelter, potentially reducing the threat to the occupied areas. However, this optimistic assessment was challenged around 0400 hours when Carl reported new sounds coming from the direction of the equipment storage building. The bear had apparently completed its investigation of the visitor center and moved on to explore other potential opportunities. The storage building contained valuable research equipment, spare parts, and emergency supplies, but more importantly, it was connected to the main complex through another walkway that hadn't been sealed. The decision to abandon the equipment storage facility was even more difficult than losing the visitor center, as it contained irreplaceable research materials and critical spare parts for the station's life support systems. However, the alternative, risking a bear encounter in a confined space, was clearly unacceptable. Carl once again volunteered to conduct the dangerous mission of sealing the walkway, despite having already exposed himself to significant risk during his previous reconnaissance. Carl's second expedition through the station's walkway system revealed the full extent of the bear's investigative capabilities. The animal had not only damaged the visitor center's exterior, but had also begun exploring the connections between buildings, apparently understanding that the walkways provided protected access to other areas. This level of strategic thinking was far beyond what any of the team members had expected from a polar bear, regardless of its intelligence. The storage building showed similar signs of systematic investigation, with insulation torn away and impact damage to windows and doors. Most alarmingly, Carl discovered that the bear had managed to partially force open a ventilation grate, creating an opening large enough for the animal to detect the scents and sounds emanating from within the building. This discovery suggested that the bear was not merely seeking shelter, but was actively investigating the possibility of accessing the food and materials stored inside. The sealing of the second walkway left the team isolated in the main complex, consisting of the laboratory, communication center, and living quarters. While this provided the greatest possible security, it also eliminated escape routes and backup facilities. Dr. Hayes noted grimly that they were now trapped in their refuge, dependent entirely on the structural integrity of the remaining buildings and the storm's eventual passage to resolve their situation. Dawn on April 9th brought no relief from either the weather or the bear's presence. The storm continued with undiminished fury, and the seismic readings indicated that the bear remained in the immediate vicinity of the station. The team's situation had become increasingly desperate, with limited food supplies, no access to backup equipment, and no possibility of communication with the outside world due to continued radio interference. Dr. Foster's documentary footage from the night had captured the tension and fear experienced by the research team, providing a unique record of human response to extreme wildlife encounter. However, her presence as an outsider complicated the team's decision-making process, as Dr. Chen felt responsible not only for his regular team members, but also for visitors who hadn't volunteered for such extreme circumstances. The morning briefing was conducted in hushed tones, with team members acutely aware that their voices might be detectable by the bear outside. Dr. Hogan explained that polar bears possessed exceptional hearing in addition to their remarkable sense of smell, capable of detecting sounds through considerable barriers. The team's presence in the building was undoubtedly known to the bear, though their exact location within the complex might remain uncertain. Dr. Tanaka's seismic data from overnight showed disturbing patterns of movement that suggested the bear had conducted a comprehensive survey of the entire station complex. The readings indicated systematic investigation of each building, with particular attention paid to areas where the bear had detected the strongest scents or sounds. This methodical approach demonstrated a level of intelligence and patience that exceeded the team's previous understanding of polar bear behavior. The bear's behavior became increasingly focused as the morning progressed, with seismic readings showing concentrated activity around the main complex's perimeter. Dr. Haugen's interpretation of the data suggested that the bear had completed its reconnaissance phase and was now beginning active attempts to gain entry to the occupied buildings. The transition from investigation to penetration attempt marked a critical escalation in the threat level. Around 1,000 hours, the team experienced their first direct contact with the bear when a massive impact shook the entire laboratory building. The sound was unlike anything they had experienced during the previous night's activities, suggesting that the bear had begun using its full strength against the building's structure. Carl's assessment of the impact damage revealed concerning stress to the building's frame, though the immediate structural integrity remained intact. The bear's attack pattern showed clear intelligence and adaptability. Rather than simply battering against the strongest points of the building, the animal appeared to be testing different areas systematically, searching for weaknesses in the construction. Dr. Hogan explained that this behavior was consistent with polar bears' problem-solving abilities, which had been documented in various research studies but rarely observed in such a direct and threatening context. The team's options for response were extremely limited. The station's emergency equipment included flare guns and noise-making devices designed to deter wildlife, but using them would require exposure to the exterior environment and potential direct confrontation with the bear. Dr. Chen was reluctant to authorize any action that might escalate the situation or expose team members to attack, preferring to rely on the building's structural defenses. However, this passive approach was challenged when the bear's attacks began causing visible damage to the laboratory's exterior walls. Insulation was torn away in large sections, and impact damage to the structural panels created potential entry points that continued attacks might widen. Carl's engineering assessment suggested that the building could withstand the bear's current level of assault, but prolonged attacks might eventually compromise the structure. The psychological pressure on the team reached critical levels as the bear's attacks continued throughout the morning. The combination of being trapped, under assault, and cut off from outside communication created a siege mentality that affected everyone's judgment and emotional stability. Dr. Patterson began showing signs of panic, repeatedly suggesting desperate escape attempts that would clearly be suicidal under the circumstances. Dr. Hayes assumed an increasingly prominent role as the team's de facto leader, his medical training having equipped him to recognize and manage the psychological symptoms of extreme stress. He organized the team into functional groups, assigning specific monitoring and support roles that provided structure and purpose during the crisis. His calm demeanor and practical approach helped maintain some semblance of order despite the terrifying circumstances. The bear's attacks reached a new level of intensity around 1200 hours, with impacts occurring at rapid intervals and causing significant structural damage. The animal appeared to have identified a weakness in the building's construction near the main entrance, where the connection between wall panels created a potential failure point. Dr. Haugen's assessment of the damage patterns suggested that the bear's attacks were becoming more focused and effective. Carl Lindberg made the courageous decision to attempt repairs to the damaged areas from inside the building, despite the obvious dangers involved. Working with improvised materials and tools, he began reinforcing the compromised sections with metal plates and support brackets. His work was conducted under extreme pressure, with the bear's attacks continuing throughout the repair process and the constant threat of sudden breach creating unbearable tension. The team's situation became truly desperate when Carl reported that his repairs were insufficient to prevent eventual breach. The bear's attacks had identified and exploited a fundamental weakness in the building's design, one that couldn't be adequately addressed with the materials and tools available. Dr. Chen faced the impossible decision between ordering an evacuation attempt that would expose the team to attack in open weather or remaining in a building that was failing under assault. The crisis reached its climax when a particularly violent impact created a visible crack in the laboratory's main wall. The damage extended from floor to ceiling, compromising the structural integrity of the entire section and creating an opening that would rapidly widen under continued attack. Carl's assessment was unequivocal. The building would be breached within minutes if the bear's assault continued at its current intensity. Dr. Haugen made a desperate suggestion that the team attempt to drive off the bear using coordinated noise and flare deployment, despite the extreme dangers involved. His experience with polar bear behavior suggested that the animal might be deterred by a sudden, overwhelming sensory assault, particularly if it was already stressed by the extreme weather conditions. The plan required precise timing and coordination, with failure likely resulting in injuries or fatalities. The team's preparation for the desperate gambit revealed the depths of their desperation and courage. Each member was assigned specific responsibilities in the coordinated response, with backup plans developed for various contingencies. Dr. Hayes prepared emergency medical supplies for immediate deployment, acknowledging that the plan carried significant risk of injury even if successful in driving off the bear. The moment of truth arrived at 13:47 hours when the bear's latest assault created a gap in the laboratory wall large enough to admit daylight. The breach was not yet sufficient for the bear to enter, but continued attacks would rapidly expand the opening. Dr. Chen gave the order to implement their desperate plan, and the team moved with practiced precision despite their terror. Carl Lindberg positioned himself at the main entrance with emergency flares and a compressed air horn, while Dr. Patterson and Dr. Tanaka prepared noise-making devices near the damaged wall. Dr. Haugen took responsibility for coordinating the timing, using his knowledge of bear behavior to maximize the effectiveness of their desperate gambit. The remainder of the team took positions in protected areas, ready to respond to injuries or provide backup if the initial plan failed. The coordinated assault began with the simultaneous deployment of multiple flares through ventilation openings, creating brilliant flashes of light and acrid smoke throughout the area around the bear's position. The compressed air horn and improvised noisemakers added overwhelming sound to the sensory assault, while team members shouted and banged on metal surfaces to increase the cacophony. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The bear's response exceeded the team's most optimistic expectations. The sudden, overwhelming assault on its senses caused the animal to retreat from the building with remarkable speed, its departure clearly visible through the damaged wall sections. The seismic readings showed rapid movement away from the station complex, suggesting that the bear was not merely repositioning, but actually fleeing from the area. However, the team's celebration was premature. Dr. Haugen warned that polar bears often retreated from immediate threats only to return after assessing the situation, particularly if they remained hungry or desperate for shelter. The temporary success of their desperate plan had bought time and demonstrated that the bear could be driven off, but it didn't guarantee their long-term safety or resolve the underlying crisis. The respite provided by the bear's retreat allowed the team to assess their situation and implement emergency repairs to the damaged laboratory. Carl Lindbergh worked frantically to patch the breach in the wall using metal sheeting and industrial adhesives, while other team members helped by providing materials and monitoring for signs of the bear's return. The repair work was crude but effective, restoring the building's basic structural integrity. Dr. Chen used the temporary lull to re-establish communication with Thule Air Base, taking advantage of a brief clearing in the radio interference that had plagued their attempts throughout the crisis. The communication was fragmentary and difficult, but sufficient to convey their desperate situation and request emergency evacuation as soon as weather conditions permitted. The response was both encouraging and sobering. Rescue operations would begin immediately upon storm clearance, but current conditions prevented any immediate assistance. The team's relief at successfully driving off the bear was tempered by the realization that their ordeal was far from over. The storm continued with undiminished intensity, preventing evacuation and maintaining the possibility that the bear might return. Dr. Haugen's assessment suggested that the animal would likely seek shelter elsewhere during the immediate aftermath of their sensory assault, but hunger and desperation might drive it back to the station once it had recovered from the shock. The afternoon was spent in tense vigilance, with team members monitoring both weather conditions and seismic readings for signs of change. Dr. Tanaka's instruments showed no immediate indication of the bear's return, but the team remained acutely aware that the animal's absence might be temporary. The psychological toll of the morning's crisis had left everyone emotionally exhausted, but the continued threat prevented any real relaxation. Dr. Foster and Thomas Brennan had captured extraordinary footage of the team's desperate gambit and the bear's retreat, providing unprecedented documentation of human-wildlife conflict in extreme circumstances. Their professional focus on recording the events had helped them cope with the terror of the situation, though both acknowledged being deeply affected by the experience. The footage would later prove invaluable for understanding polar bear behavior and improving safety protocols at Arctic research facilities. The team's dinner was a quiet affair, with conversation focused on lessons learned and preparations for potential future encounters. Dr. Haugen conducted an informal debriefing session, analyzing the bear's behavior patterns and the effectiveness of their defensive responses. His assessment provided valuable insights into polar bear psychology and suggested improvements to research station design and emergency protocols. As evening approached, the storm showed the first signs of potentially weakening. Wind speeds had decreased to 65 miles per hour, and the temperature had risen slightly to -38 degrees Fahrenheit. While conditions remained extremely dangerous for any outdoor activity, the trend suggested that evacuation might become possible within 12 to 18 hours if the improvement continued. The night shift was organized with particular attention to security protocols, with team members maintaining constant vigilance for signs of the bear's return. The seismic monitoring equipment was supplemented with improvised early warning systems, including metal containers positioned around the complex's perimeter that would create noise if disturbed. These crude but effective detection methods provided additional security while conserving the team's mental and physical energy for emergency response. Dr. Hayes conducted medical examinations of all team members, documenting the physical and psychological effects of their prolonged crisis. Several individuals showed signs of stress-related symptoms, including elevated blood pressure, anxiety reactions, and sleep disturbances. His medical assessment would later prove important for understanding the long-term health impacts of extreme wildlife encounters and developing support protocols for similar situations. The night passed without incident, though the team's sleep was fitful and frequently interrupted by false alarms and stress-induced hypervigilance. The absence of seismic readings indicating bear activity was encouraging, but Dr. Haugen cautioned against assuming that the threat had permanently passed. Polar bears were capable of traveling great distances and might return to investigate the station after the storm passed and conditions improved. April 10th dawned with significantly improved weather conditions. Wind speeds had decreased to 40 miles per hour and visibility had improved dramatically as the blowing snow subsided. The temperature remained dangerously low at -41°F, but the overall conditions represented a marked improvement from the previous day's extreme weather. Most importantly, radio communications were now possible, allowing regular contact with Thule Air Base and coordination of rescue operations. Dr. Chen's first communication with base operations confirmed that evacuation procedures were already underway. 2 helicopters equipped for extreme weather operations had been placed on standby, waiting only for further improvement in wind conditions to launch rescue operations. The estimated time for evacuation was 6 to 8 hours, assuming continued weather improvement and no complications from wildlife encounters. The team's mood improved dramatically with the prospect of imminent rescue, though Dr. Haugen continued to counsel caution regarding the bear threat. His experience suggested that polar bears often return to investigate areas of previous interest, particularly if environmental conditions improved. The clearing weather that would enable helicopter evacuation would also make the station more accessible to the bear that had previously threatened them. Carl Lindberg conducted a comprehensive assessment of the station's damage, documenting the extensive destruction caused by the bear's systematic assault. The visitor center had suffered severe structural damage, with multiple entry points breached and interior spaces contaminated by weather exposure. The equipment storage building had also been compromised, though less severely, and much of the critical research equipment had been damaged or destroyed. The main laboratory complex had survived the bear's attack, though significant repairs would be required before the facility could return to normal operations. Carl's assessment suggested that repairs would take several months and require specialized materials and equipment suitable for Arctic conditions. The incident would likely result in temporary closure of the research station while security improvements were implemented. Dr. Foster's documentation of the incident had captured not only the dramatic confrontation with the bear, but also the human dimension of survival in extreme conditions. Her interviews with team members revealed the psychological impact of the prolonged crisis, providing insights into stress responses and coping mechanisms that would be valuable for future emergency preparedness training. As the morning progressed, weather conditions continued to improve steadily. Wind speeds decreased to 35 miles per hour, and visibility extended to several hundred meters as the storm system moved eastward. Radio communications became increasingly reliable, allowing detailed coordination of evacuation procedures with Thule Air Base Operations Center. The first helicopter arrived at 10:45 hours, approaching the station with extreme caution due to continued high winds and potential wildlife threats. The pilot conducted several reconnaissance passes to assess landing conditions and verify the absence of the polar bear that had been reported in the area. The helicopter's arrival marked the beginning of the team's deliverance from their ordeal, though evacuation procedures would require several hours to complete safely. Dr. Hayes and the most severely affected team members were evacuated in the first helicopter lift, along with critical research data and documentation of the incident. The medical assessment conducted at Thule Air Base revealed that several individuals required treatment for stress-related conditions and minor injuries sustained during the crisis. Dr. Hayes' thorough documentation of the team's medical status throughout the ordeal provided valuable data for understanding the health impacts of extreme survival situations. The second helicopter arrived 2 hours later to complete the evacuation, transporting the remaining team members and essential equipment salvaged from the damaged station. Dr. Chen was the last to leave, conducting a final survey of the facility that had been his responsibility and home for several years. The sight of the damaged buildings and evidence of the bear's destructive investigation would remain with him as a powerful reminder of nature's overwhelming power. The evacuation marked the end of the immediate crisis, but the beginning of a complex process of investigation, recovery, and analysis. The incident at Thule 7 Research Station represented an unprecedented example of polar bear-human conflict, providing valuable data for wildlife management and research station safety protocols. The team's survival had depended on their professional training, teamwork, and ultimately desperate courage in the face of overwhelming danger. Dr. Haugen's preliminary assessment of the bear's behavior revealed concerning patterns that suggested significant changes in polar bear psychology and survival strategies. The animal's systematic investigation of the research station, combined with its persistence and problem-solving abilities, indicated adaptation to changing environmental conditions that brought bears into increased conflict with human activities. His recommendations for future research station design would emphasize security features previously considered unnecessary for scientific facilities. The medical treatment of team members at Thule Air Base and subsequent facilities revealed the full extent of the psychological trauma experienced during their ordeal. Dr. Patterson required extended treatment for anxiety disorders, while several other team members showed symptoms of post-traumatic stress that would require ongoing therapy. Dr. Hayes' medical documentation provided crucial data for developing treatment protocols for similar situations. The investigation that followed the incident involved multiple agencies, including wildlife management authorities, research facility oversight organizations, and emergency response coordinators. The comprehensive documentation provided by Dr. Foster's filming and the team's detailed logs offered unprecedented insight into the progression of a polar bear attack on a research facility. The findings would influence safety protocols and emergency procedures for Arctic research operations throughout the polar regions. The damaged Thule 7 research station was temporarily abandoned, while repairs and security improvements were implemented. The incident had demonstrated fundamental vulnerabilities in research facility design that hadn't been previously recognized, leading to comprehensive reviews of safety protocols at similar installations throughout the Arctic. The cost of repairs and improvements would exceed $2 million, reflecting the extensive damage and the need for enhanced protective measures. Dr. Volkov's seal population research had to be postponed indefinitely due to the loss of equipment and data collection facilities. Her preliminary findings about changes in seal behavior that might have contributed to increased polar bear desperation were incorporated into Dr. Haugen's analysis of the incident. The connection between changing Arctic ecosystem dynamics and increased human-wildlife conflict became a central focus of subsequent research efforts. The international media attention generated by the incident brought unprecedented focus to Arctic research and the challenges faced by scientists working in polar regions. Dr. Foster's documentary footage provided compelling evidence of both the dangers inherent in Arctic research and the dedication of scientists working to understand climate change impacts. The incident became a powerful symbol of the intersection between human activity and environmental change in the Arctic. 6 months after the incident, Dr. Chen led a team back to Thule 7 to oversee restoration of the research facility. The new design incorporated extensive wildlife deterrent systems, reinforced structures, and emergency evacuation procedures based on lessons learned from their harrowing encounter. The rebuilt station would serve as a model for Arctic research facility design, though it would never completely eliminate the risks inherent in working in one of Earth's most challenging environments. Dr. Haugen's comprehensive analysis of the incident contributed to a fundamental revision of polar bear management policies in research areas. His recommendations led to new protocols for monitoring bear activity near research facilities and improved communication systems for coordinating responses to wildlife threats. The incident at Thule 7 became a case study taught in emergency management and Arctic safety training programs worldwide. The team members who survived the ordeal went on to distinguished careers in their respective fields, though all carried lasting psychological scars from their encounter with one of nature's most powerful predators. Their experience provided them with unique insights into human behavior under extreme stress and the importance of teamwork in survival situations. Several became advocates for improved safety measures and emergency preparedness in remote research operations. The polar bear that had terrorized the research station was never definitively identified or tracked after the incident. Dr. Haugen's analysis suggested that the animal was likely a large male, displaced by changing ice conditions and driven to desperate measures by hunger and the need for shelter. The bear's fate remained unknown, though its behavior had provided crucial insights into the adaptability and intelligence of polar bears facing environmental challenges. The incident at Thule 7 Research Station on April 9, 2025, stands as a testament to both human resilience and the awesome power of Arctic wildlife. The 11 adults who were injured during the bear's systematic assault on their facility survived through a combination of professional training, teamwork, and desperate courage. Their experience provided valuable lessons for Arctic research safety and contributed to our understanding of changing polar bear behavior in a rapidly warming world. The psychological and physical trauma experienced by the research team highlighted the hidden costs of scientific work in extreme environments. Their recovery process involved months of medical treatment and psychological therapy, with some team members requiring years to fully process the trauma of their encounter. The incident led to improved support systems for researchers working in dangerous environments and better preparation for the psychological challenges of remote fieldwork. Dr. Foster's documentary about the incident, eventually titled When the Ice Breaks: Terror at the Top of the World, won numerous awards and brought international attention to the challenges facing Arctic researchers. The film's powerful combination of spectacular footage and human drama helped educate the public about both the importance of polar research and the very real dangers faced by scientists working to understand climate change. The rebuilt Thule 7 research station reopened 18 months after the incident, equipped with state-of-the-art wildlife deterrent systems and emergency response capabilities. The facility became a model for Arctic Research Station design, though the memories of April 9, 2025 served as a constant reminder of the untamed power of the polar environment. The station's new motto, "Prepared for all conditions," reflected the hard-earned wisdom gained from their terrifying encounter. The legacy of the incident extends far beyond the individual experiences of those who lived through it. The comprehensive documentation of the bear's behavior provided crucial data for understanding polar bear adaptation to changing environmental conditions. The incident contributed to revised wildlife management policies and improved safety protocols that have protected countless researchers in the years since the attack. Dr. Chen, reflecting on the experience years later, noted that the incident had fundamentally changed his understanding of the relationship between human activity and Arctic wildlife. The research station had been designed as a place to study environmental change, but it had become the subject of a dramatic demonstration of how that change was affecting the behavior of one of the Arctic's most iconic species. The bear's desperate assault on their facility was, in many ways, a physical manifestation of the broader environmental crisis they had dedicated their careers to studying. The incident at Thule 7 Research Station remains one of the most thoroughly documented polar bear attacks on record, providing unprecedented insight into both bear behavior and human response to extreme wildlife encounters. The survival of all 11 team members was attributed to their professional training, effective leadership under pressure, and ultimately their willingness to take desperate risks when conventional safety measures failed. Their experience continues to inform Arctic safety protocols and emergency response procedures, helping to protect future generations of researchers working in one of Earth's most challenging environments. The story of April 9, 2025, serves as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration, demonstrating the very real dangers faced by those who venture into the Arctic in pursuit of scientific knowledge, while also highlighting the remarkable capacity for human courage and cooperation when survival itself is at stake. The research team's ordeal became a defining moment in Arctic research history, changing forever how scientists approach the challenge of working safely in polar bear country. As climate change continues to alter the Arctic environment, the lessons learned from the Thule 7 incident become increasingly relevant. The bear that terrorized the research station was likely acting out of desperation caused by changing ice conditions and reduced access to traditional food sources. Understanding and preparing for such encounters is crucial as human activity in the Arctic increases and polar bear habitat continues to shrink. The incident stands as a powerful reminder that despite our technological capabilities and scientific knowledge, we remain vulnerable to the awesome forces of nature. The 11 researchers who faced down a polar bear in one of Earth's most remote locations exemplified the dedication and courage required for scientific advancement, while their survival demonstrated the importance of preparation, teamwork, and the will to survive against overwhelming odds. Their story continues to resonate with researchers, emergency responders, and anyone who ventures into wild places where humans are not the dominant species. The bear attack at Thule 7 Research Station on April 9, 2025 remains a defining moment in Arctic research history, a testament to both human vulnerability and human resilience in the face of nature's ultimate test.